Colombia, one of South America's most vibrant destinations, known for its fervent music, warm community, diverse landscapes, and incredible coffee, it doesn't take long to realise how special of a country this is. And hey, since you're here, I imagine you're already pretty intrigued by this region. Maybe you're a tourist planning a holiday, or you might be an expat who's resided in the country for years. You may even be a Colombian citizen who's lived in the country your whole life. Whatever the case, if you pressed on this video to learn more about this incredible nation, well, have I got a video for you. Hi all, I'm Ezrado and you're watching my travel channel where I talk all things Colombia. Now I realise there are a lot of videos from expats on YouTube which document and describe modern life in Colombia. No doubt these sorts of videos have helped many of you in understanding the country as it stands today. Have you ever wondered though, what was Colombia like, say, a century ago? Or maybe 2 centuries ago? What about 500 years ago? I mean, how and when exactly did the nation of Colombia first come to exist? Was it even called Colombia originally? Were its borders always where they are now? And how did the nation get from its ancient beginnings to the point it's at today? As you may have noticed, these aren't exactly topics you'll often hear discussed in your typical YouTube expat videos. It's these kinds of historical insights, however, that will arguably help you understand a nation on a level much deeper than what you glean from most other resources. That's why, over the last 2 years, I've spent hundreds of hours putting together this video you're watching right now. If you stick around, I'll recount to you the region's entire history, from the ancient days of pre-conquest all the way up to present day 2026. Ultimately, my goal here is to make this one of the most comprehensive videos about Colombia you'll ever watch. Of course, for such a task, this won't exactly be a quick viewing experience, but if you're along for the ride, then I'm thrilled to present to you a detailed history of Colombia. Now, before we get started, I have just a few quick housekeeping items. First of all, I just wanted to mention that I've added chapters to this video corresponding to various historical eras and events. This should make it easier for you if you want to skip ahead to any particular part of history that interests you. You can find the full list of these chapters along with their timestamps in the description. Secondly, I wanted to give a massive shout out to this book right here from Oxford University Press titled Colombia: What Everyone Needs to Know by historian Richard D. Mahoney. A lot of my research for this video was done using this particular book, and so I feel like some credit was in order. Beyond the detail it provided, the book also really helped me ascertain what all the most important events and developments have been throughout Colombian history. So yeah, really invaluable stuff. Highly recommend reading it for even more detail. You can also find a full list of references along with my transcript document via the link I put in the description. Finally, I do want to acknowledge right off the bat that Colombia does have quite a checkered history that's been pretty tragic at times, I won't lie. In discussing that history for 3+ hours therefore, there is a risk that some of you may walk away with a negative perception of the country. As someone who's lived in Colombia for a year and constantly finds themselves returning, however, I would really encourage you to look beyond just the history, as valuable as it is, as I do truly believe there's so much to love here as well. With that in mind, I put together a playlist of some other videos where I discuss some of my favourite aspects of Colombia, just to give you a more well-rounded view of the country. If you're interested, you can find a link to that in the description as well. Anyway, with all that being said, I think that's more than enough preamble, so let's get started, shall we? Our story begins as early as 10,000 BC. Archaeological evidence suggests that hunter-gatherer societies occupied the region of modern-day Colombia as far back as the late Pleistocene era. Over thousands of years, these early groups would then slowly transition into more settled agricultural societies, paving the way for relatively complex indigenous civilizations by around 1500 BC. In the following centuries and millennium, a number of indigenous groups known today would begin to emerge, each with their own societal traditions. Such traditions commonly included a strong focus on intensive agriculture, weaving, organised religion, class structures, and sometimes, to a lesser extent, the use of matrilineality to determine the inheritance of leadership roles. Many, though far from all of these groups, would also share various language families such as Chibchan, common throughout the regions of now modern-day Colombia, Panama, and Costa Rica. These communities were not, however, united politically. As a matter of fact, many would stand in political rivalry, sometimes even giving way to large-scale warfare. Additionally, beyond broad similarities, the many distinct biomes across the region would give way to significant cultural distinctions between groups. Societies in the Andes Highlands, for instance, were in large part culturally disparate to, say, groups in the Caribbean region. Within each region, however, groups would often share a number of cultural commonalities. To start us off, therefore, I thought it might be helpful to describe some of the common cultural traditions in just a few of these geographic zones. We'll begin with the Andean Highlands. This region was occupied by some of the more socially and politically complex societies, including the Muisca, the Guane, the Lache, and the Sutagao. These civilizations consisted of highly organized chiefdoms, meaning that they were governed under centralized regional chiefs, such as the Zipa and the Zake among the Muisca. They were commonly known for their strong religious institutions, which included temple complexes and priesthoods, intensive crop production, and oftentimes, particularly among the Muisca, a practice of matrilineal leadership inheritance, as alluded to earlier. Perhaps most famously, however, were their vast exchange networks, which traded salt, textiles, emeralds, and even gold, the latter of which carried significant value both symbolically and practically among the elite. Muisca tunhos, for instance, essentially miniature gold humans, animals, or deities, would be deposited into temples and other sacred places as offerings, with the intention of invoking divine favour. Other objects, meanwhile, would be used as burial offerings, ceremonial items, and diplomatic gifts used to seal alliances. Many of these objects were highly intricate by design and symbolised important cultural values such as fertility, social rank, and even spiritual beliefs. Typically, objects used in the region were crafted by highly skilled hereditary goldsmiths among the Muisca, along with the Quimbaya and Tolima communities to the west and southwest. Moving on from the Andean highlands, let's next take a look at the communities in the Caribbean region. Firstly, we have the Caribbean lowlands, represented by communities such as the Zenu, the Chimila, the Mocana, and the Wayu, all of whom still occupy the region somewhat autonomously to this day, particularly the Wayu. These groups were known to be more decentralized compared to those in the Andean highlands, with some groups even maintaining a structure of clans. They'd often consist of sedentary farming and trading societies, with many living permanently throughout dispersed towns. As societies located throughout both wetlands and dry scrublands, these groups were highly acclaimed for their engineering feats such as dikes, along with their large irrigation networks in river valleys used to support agriculture. Beyond the lowlands, we also have the Caribbean's northern highlands, namely the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. This region was, and in some cases still is, home to groups including the Tairona, the Canquamo, the Kogi, the Ahuaco, and the Wiwa, mountain-dwelling societies commonly known for their unique spiritual beliefs, which were often tied to nature and ecological cosmology. Such beliefs would also emphasize the importance of social harmony over ideas of conquest or expansion, a notable distinction from many other civilizations. In terms of leadership, these communities were typically governed by theocratic rule, with elders and spiritual leaders known as mamos claiming moral authority. In terms of settlement, groups in this region were often known to build stone cities, such as the site now called Ciudad Perdida, the ruins of which can still be found today. Moving much further south, we next come to the Amazon Basin region, home to a high concentration of surviving autonomous communities even today, including the Ticuna, the Huitoto, the Bora, the Cubeo, and the Yucuna. These societies were largely known for their semi-nomadic lifestyles, which would see them relocate periodically, often influenced by natural resource availability and horticultural cycles. Speaking of horticulture, a clear point of distinction for these groups was their practice of slash-and-burn agriculture, a farming methodology that involves clearing small patches of forest before burning felled vegetation, thereby releasing vital nutrients into the otherwise nutrient-poor rainforest soil. This in turn would allow for the cultivation of crops in the rainforest, such as cassava, plantain, and maize. Beyond farming methodology, another notable distinction for the Amazonian peoples were their egalitarian structures consisting of kinship clans, which were often far less hierarchical than groups of other regions. Their spiritual beliefs, meanwhile, would stand out for their emphasis on shamanism, animism, and oral tradition, the latter of which distinguished these societies for their rich mythology. These beliefs would also be intensely ritualized through major ceremonial practices, with some groups, for instance, utilizing ayahuasca to induce intense psychedelic experiences. So those were just a few of the distinct cultures found across the region that's now Colombia. However, I should note that there are also several other distinct cultural geographic zones. These include the Orinoco region, the Cauca Valley and Western Cordillera slopes, the Pacific Choco rainforest and mangrove coast, along with the Upper and Middle Magdalena Valley. Together, these combined regions, now known as Colombia, would support by around 1500 BC an estimated 3 to 10 million across dozens of separate societies. Today, meanwhile, Colombia recognizes 115 indigenous peoples, who represent around 10% of the population. Sadly, the Spanish conquest did reduce their population significantly, which I'll get into later, though many of their ancestors do continue to uphold cultural traditions and in some cases even operate with societal autonomy. Alright, so now we know a bit about Colombia's original inhabitants, it's time to talk about the Spanish. The story of Colombia's European colonization begins with Christopher Columbus, who famously stumbled across the Caribbean islands in 1492. Despite the nation of Colombia bearing his name, however, the first European reconnaissance in this region was from Spanish explorer Alonso de Ojeda just 7 years later in 1499. During their explorations, Ojeda's expedition would reportedly encounter many indigenous communities who traded salt, cotton, and ornamental gold, likely panned or mined from local rivers. Whilst Ojeda's attempt at settlement would ultimately fail due to disease, indigenous resistance, and food shortages, his tales of gold and riches relayed to him by local indigenous peoples would soon draw wide attention throughout Spain. Before long, myths of entire lands overflowing with wealth would draw men across oceans. While Spain initially had their attention on the Caribbean islands, this newfound potential for mineral wealth would avert their focus toward the mainland. One of the most consequential expeditions to the continent following Ojeda was led by explorer Vasco Núñez de Balboa, who was seeking both riches and a route to the mysterious South Sea in 1513. Similar to Ojeda, however, his expedition, which began around the modern-day Gulf of Urabá, would face fierce resistance from indigenous groups upon arrival. This, along with a lack of provisions and hostile terrain, would motivate his group to seek a more viable base of operations, leading them northwards to the Isthmus of Darien, around the border of today's Colombia and Panama. It was here that they'd established the first stable Spanish settlement on the continent, Santa Maria la Antigua del Darien. Balboa's most famous accomplishment, though, would occur later that same year, when he would cross the isthmus and be the first European to sight the Pacific Ocean from the continent. Sadly, his triumph would be short-lived, however, as just 6 years later in 1519, Balboa was executed on charges of treason from the Spanish administration. Balboa's fame would then later be eclipsed by none other than his lieutenant, Francisco Pizarro, who would eventually conquer the Incan Empire, stealing huge swaths of gold and silver in the process. It was this event that truly sent the Spanish gold frenzy into high gear. In 1525, Colombia's oldest surviving Spanish settlement, Santa Marta, was founded by conquistador Rodrigo de Bastidas, but the magnetic pull of potential wealth further inland would soon draw settlers away from the town into southern regions. One such venture was led by a relatively unknown Spanish lawyer, Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada. In 1536, he'd lead 800 men along the Magdalena River in an expedition that would soon turn catastrophic. The soldiers would eventually become stranded with no food after their supply ships were destroyed in a storm. Reduced to eating local animals such as lizards, bats, and rats, along with boiled leather from their own garments, 2/3 of the group would die out within 6 months. For all their troubles, however, what they would eventually discover would change the course of history. Hidden within the eastern Cordillera of the Andean highlands lay one of the largest organised indigenous societies in the entirety of Latin America, consisting of anywhere between 300,000 and 2 million Muisca people. At first, the Muisca Confederation was hostile to the group's arrival, although their wooden weapons would ultimately prove no match against Spanish steel. Interestingly, Quesada at least initially imposed a relatively strict code of conduct against violence towards the Muisca. This, however, would be abandoned upon the discovery of the civilization's immense treasure. As a society who used gold as a material for many of their objects of ritual trade and adornment, it wasn't long before the Spaniards caught on to their wealth. The group would then proceed to capture and interrogate their most potentially lucrative targets, the Muisca chieftains, even going as far as to kill the Zipa, ruler of the southern Muisca, in an attempt to uncover their riches. Following the death of the Zipa, the Spaniards would then try and strategically manipulate his successor, Sahipa, by allying with him in a fight against an invading rival tribe. When Sahipa would not, or could not, produce the expected amounts of gold the Spanish had demanded in return though, they would turn on him, torturing him for a confession of the gold's location, before eventually killing him. Ultimately, the Spanish would still uncover immense wealth, namely over 200,000 pesos worth of gold, along with nearly 2,000 emeralds. Additionally, they'd also forcibly take numerous Muisca women for themselves, some of whom bore mixed-race children who were then baptized. By 1538, Quesada would grant this land a formal name, the Nuevo Reino de Granada, or the New Kingdom of Granada, after his home city back in Spain. Near the now ruined Muisca capital of Bogotá, he also founded a new city, which he called Santa Fe. Later, it was renamed to Santa Fe de Bogotá, with Bogotá being the Spanish approximation of Bogotá, the aforementioned Muisca city. By 1717, it would become the capital city of Nueva Granada under the creation of the region's own viceroyalty that same year. As one may guess, this city is now modern-day Bogotá, the capital city of Colombia. Meanwhile, back in 1538, the city's founding would also see the arrival of a couple of conquistador rivals who wanted to claim the territory for themselves. Namely, Sebastián de Belalcázar, who'd recently founded Cali and Popayán in 1536 and 37 respectively, along with Nicolas Ferdinand, a German conquistador in Spanish service who's credited as Riohacha's founder in 1535. Submitting their competing claims of ownership to the King of Spain, the crown would eventually recognise Quesada as the leader, making his conquest official. Beyond Santa Fe de Bogotá, perhaps equally notable this decade was the founding of Cartagena in 1533 by conquistador Pedro de Heredia, who transformed a local fishing village into a key port for Spanish trade and, sadly, slave trade for centuries to follow. The following decade, in 1542, the area that would later become Nueva Granada, along with the rest of the continent, would be placed under the Viceroyalty of Peru, marking a major turning point for the region since its initial governance from Santo Domingo. Amidst these developments though, the mystery of indigenous gold reserves would persist among conquistadors for decades to come. Another myth driving the colonial obsession came in the form of a southern muisca ritual, in which their new chieftain, as part of an initiation ceremony, would be coated in powdered gold before sailing to the centre of a crater known as Lake Guatavita. Here, he would make offerings of gold and emeralds, which would be thrown into the lake. This chieftain would become known among the Spanish as El Dorado, or the Gilded One, marking the origin of this iconic title. Upon hearing the myth, attempts were made by the Spanish to drain the lake in order to uncover its supposed treasures. Though some gold artifacts were recovered, it was far from enough to quench their insatiable thirst for wealth. Instead of giving up though, the Spaniards only took the Guatavita ritual as evidence for greater treasures, perhaps further inland. Fueled by this ever-lingering potential, conquistadors and other explorers would continue to spread across the continent in search of their fortune. As tales of wealth became more exaggerated by the Spaniards, the term El Dorado would even evolve to the point of inferring not a golden chieftain, but rather an entire mythical kingdom of gold. One of the men wrapped up in this wishful search endeavour was Gonzalo Pizarro, half-brother of aforementioned Francisco Pizarro, who conquered the Incan Empire. Under his belief that the jungle hid a city of fierce warrior women, supposedly the descendants of the mythical Amazons, his informants would soon find themselves deep in lush jungle terrain. No city was found, but its legend stuck. Later encounters with indigenous women in the area who matched the aforementioned Amazonian descendants in description would even inspire the name of the jungle's main river, the Amazon River, before later extending to the entire region as simply the Amazon. Meanwhile, around this same time, another conquistador, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, would lead an expedition from Mexico in search of the legendary 7 gold cities of Cibola. Once again, these efforts, however, would prove fruitless. Despite spanning thousands of kilometers across harsh deserts and plains, Coronado would find only humble indigenous villages, far from the golden metropolises he imagined. The lure of El Dorado would endure though, even beyond Spain. In the late 1500s, an English statesman named Sir Walter Raleigh would search for a golden kingdom along the Orinoco River in modern-day Venezuela. Although he failed to find El Dorado, Raleigh would go on to publish a famous account of his journey titled The Discovery of the Large, Rich and Beautiful Empire of Guyana, which would bring fame to the region across much of the English-speaking world. He'd also launch a second expedition in 1617, only this one would not end only in failure, but catastrophe. Mutiny spread, ships were lost, and expeditioners would become involved in a violent skirmish with Spanish forces, violating a peace treaty between the nations. This latter incident would then motivate King James, King of England, to have Raleigh executed in order to appease the Spanish crown. Amidst many of these pursuits for mythical gold cities and abundant wealth, however, laid a far darker reality: the brutal plundering and systematic subjugation of indigenous societies. For starters, their first meetings with conquistadors would often involve a colonial declaration claiming divine right to rule over their lands. Specifically, a legal document known as a requerimiento was read aloud to these communities, threatening violent subjugation should they resist Spanish authority and acceptance of Christianity. This, however, was often a hollow formality. Many conquistadors would simply read the requerimiento out of obligation before launching a premeditated violent attack. After the victims were ensnared, the Spanish would then utilize an institutionalized system known as an encomienda. Under this system, individual colonists were assigned professional ownership of the entire indigenous communities. Despite being considered a form of protection by the Spanish, in practice these communities were really being tasked with performing brutal labor on colonial farms and mines, or being forced to hand over their goods and pay taxes in the form of gold, food, and textiles. Before long, this system had become a driving force of the economy across the new kingdom of Granada, and by the end of the century, the imbalance had only grown more extreme. Roughly 600 Spaniards were said to have been supported by an estimated 40,000 indigenous tribute payers in Santa Fe de Bogotá alone, while in Tunja, it was claimed to have been around 200 to 50,000. As mentioned, the wealth extracted from these communities formed the backbone of much of the economy, as it was not only used to support local colonial elites, but also bring royal taxes back to the Spanish crown, who would further fuel a conquest. In response to the injustice, many indigenous groups such as the Panches, Guane, and Pijao would launch uprisings against the Spanish, only to be met with brutal military campaigns against them. Beyond violence and displacement, many would also succumb to disease brought over by the Spanish. Thankfully, the Crown would eventually choose to institutionalize a formal administrative and judicial council over the conquistadors known as the Audiencia in 1549 to impose some semblance of order and governance. Later came the appointment of the first president of the region, Andres Diaz Venero de Leyva, who led the Audiencia from 1564 under the authority of the Viceroy of Peru. Unfortunately, however, the brutal subjugation of indigenous peoples would continue for decades to come. The conquistadors were not the only group exhibiting influence over these communities, however. Alongside the conquest came missionaries who would erect churches in the region and baptize thousands of indigenous people into the Catholic faith. Over time, this Catholic faith would merge with indigenous traditions and beliefs to bring about a form of religious syncretism, although this was generally opposed by colonial authorities. By the mid-16th century, movement towards moral treatment of indigenous people was finally beginning to emerge. At the centre of this swing was a Dominican friar named Bartolomé de las Casas. Las Casas had long advocated for such change, previously having renounced his own encomienda in protest. His many letters, petitions and treatises on the subject would eventually culminate in the Spanish crown passing new laws in 1542, aiming to end indigenous enslavement by phasing out the encomienda system. While many in Spain saw these new enslavement laws as a step in the right direction, for the conquistadors it was a different story. Many had grown wealthy thanks to the forced labour and were not ready to give this up. So they just ignored the laws and would continue to exploit indigenous people either illegally or via legal loopholes. The Crown, however, fearful of a drop in revenue, had another solution: the mass importation of African slaves. Beyond being a supposed moral replacement, the Crown was also influenced by emerging pseudo-scientific ideas at the time, proposing African labour as more durable. Specifically, Africans were considered less susceptible to Spanish diseases such as influenza and smallpox, which had wiped out millions of indigenous people, partially contributing later to a population decline of up to 90% in New Granada alone by the 1600s. With these factors in mind, African labour would become the new cornerstone of the economy, especially prominent in industries such as cattle ranching, gold mining, sugar production, and urban construction. Most of this was made possible through Spain's new asiento system, which was a royal license issued to foreign merchants, allowing them to legally supply enslaved Africans to Spain's American colonies. At the centre of this economic order was Cartagena, the previously mentioned port city, which by the late 1500s had developed the region's largest slave market in its central plaza. The degree to which human life was financially formalised here was nothing short of absurd. Slaves were provided as high-interest loans, contracts were overseen by lawyers, and notaries and health workers were even employed to assess the individual's market value based on age and physical condition. The city also established an official slave tribunal, aimed at mediating any disputes over property rights. As the labour force intensified, so too did the overall transatlantic trade, and in turn, opportunities for contraband. Illicit cargo such as gold was often smuggled by local networks of merchants and even colonial officers who were bribed for a share in profits. This would eventually become enough of an issue for the Spanish crown to intervene, attempting to rein in the black market. Smugglers, however, would simply shift their operations to other ports in the region, such as Santa Marta and Riohacha. In addition to smugglers, Cartagena's wealth also attracted pirate assaults. Perhaps the most infamous of these came in 1586, when English privateer Sir Francis Drake held the city for ransom during a devastating raid. To prevent this from continuing, a top Italian military engineer, Battista Antonelli, was contracted to design and construct huge stone walls to surround the entire city. Construction took around 200 years before it was completed by Spanish military engineer Don Antonio de Arevalo. Credit must also be given, however, to the many slaves who gave their lives to work on the wall and received little to no recognition. It was also largely thanks to the slaves that Spain could afford the wall's construction to begin with, as much of it was paid through taxes on goods that slaves themselves had produced. Only further motivating the constant slave importation was the fact that many African workers faced very short lifespans. This is generally attributed to the brutal work conditions in many physically intensive industries, such as gold mining, where slaves would work to exhaustion in riverbeds and waterlogged pits. Slaves in urban areas, however, would often occupy more domestic roles, such as artisans, cooks, and family servants. In some cases, enslaved African women, along with indigenous women, would be involved in sexual relationships with Spanish men, sometimes eventually marrying. Interestingly, this would sometimes contribute to emancipation, as marriage could be seen as a rationale for freedom under the belief of the Catholic Church. Sadly, however, these relationships were frequently exploitative, and even freed slaves could often face many legal restrictions, such as not being allowed to enter certain neighbourhoods or wear certain clothing. Still, among the liberated, vibrant communities and mutual aid societies began to form, helping their members secure legal representation and defending them against re-enslavement, much to the dismay of colonial authorities. In a desperate attempt to regulate such widespread racial mixing, these authorities and elites would utilise a highly racist racial caste system. Within this system, people were codified into racial categories, creating a rigid hierarchy. Such categories included mestizo, a mix of Spanish and Indigenous, mulatto, a mix of Spanish and African, and lobo, a mix of Indigenous and African. This went well beyond first-generation racial mixes too, also categorising mixes of mixes, such as the cambujo, a mix between the aforementioned lobo and Indigenous. At the top of this hierarchy were those of exclusive Spanish ancestry, but even among them, higher value was given to those born in Spain than the Creoles born in New Granada. Before long, the caste system would become entrenched in many aspects of society. One such example could be witnessed during Cartagena's annual Carnaval celebrations, where dancers would enter the festivities in order of racial hierarchy and would be expected to perform dances stereotypical of their culture. Eventually, this would give way to newly evolved cultural traditions. The music genre of cumbia, for instance, would originate as a syncretism between Indigenous and African traditions, blending instruments from both cultures, such as the African tambora drum and the Indigenous gaita flute. Over time, the genre would become a strong symbol of resistance for these cultures, offering rare moments of autonomy amidst colonial oppression. Fortunately, however, a number of slaves would also find a proper form of independence from the colonial system. Thanks to several cultural uprisings throughout the 17th century, many slaves, particularly African, would escape into the interior and establish their own communities known as palenques. The most famous of these settlements was San Basilio de Palenque, located in the modern-day department of Bolivar. Its impressive tenacity in resisting colonial authority would eventually lead King Carlos II to cave in and grant a decree in 1691 to guarantee the community's independence, a great rarity in the colonial world. The residents of San Basilio would also develop their own independent language known as Palanquero, which blended Spanish with elements of West African dialects. This language is still spoken in the village to this day, standing as a living testament of cultural endurance. Outside of the Palenques, emancipation was rare on the whole, yet certain pacification initiatives were underway. This would generally come in the form of Christian missionaries, who'd come to the continent to share the gospel with the indigenous. Despite the great challenge in dealing with multiple indigenous languages, the missionaries would eventually gain fluency and even go as far as to document the histories of their cultures into vast volumes of books, which sometimes included criticism of Spanish conquest. One Jesuit priest, Alonso de Sandoval, would gain particular notoriety for his criticism of slavery. His student, Pedro Claver, would take these ideas multiple steps further, choosing to dedicate his life to serving slaves in Cartagena, both physically and spiritually. Today, he's remembered as the patron saint of slaves, having apparently baptized hundreds of thousands throughout the early to mid-1600s. Unfortunately, however, not all Jesuits had such a noble intent. With the vast influence they'd gained over the economy, particularly as part of the Catholic Church, which had amassed extraordinary wealth by now, some argue that they behaved more like landlords and businessmen rather than spiritual leaders. Many Jesuits even had slaves on their own estates. Before long, Spain would become concerned with their growing power, particularly during the shift to the Bourbon monarchy under Charles III, who wanted tighter control of their empire. Therefore, in 1767, the monarchy would pass sweeping reforms aimed at consolidating royal power. This centralising of control had arguably begun decades prior with the establishment of a viceroyalty in Nueva Granada back in 1739. Still, these 1767 reforms took things to a new level. They included a controversial overhaul of the region's tax structure, a decision to exclude Creoles from high military and administrative appointments, a revoking of many of the church's legal privileges, and, notably, the swift expulsion of Jesuits from all Spanish territories. This all came as a huge shock across society in Nueva Granada, and would only further fuel suspicions that the Crown harvested hostility towards its subjects in the Americas. Despite the Crown's consolidation of power, however, the Church, even with its growing severance from Spain and loss of Jesuits, continued to hold great cultural influence throughout the region. Among Afro-descendant communities, for instance, Catholic imagery was blended with ancestral African traditions to form a new syncretic belief system. These practices were often publicly denounced by the Catholic Church, who would routinely run inspections on congregations and sometimes sentence those with pagan beliefs to punishment, including public floggings and imprisonment. Interestingly, punishment for these practices, however, was often less severe for African and Indigenous peoples than it was for Spaniards. This came down to the Church's belief that non-Spanish communities were less educated and therefore deserved less blame compared to the Spaniards, who should know better. The Spaniards, therefore, were among the most common group to be punished at Cartagena's infamous Palace of the Inquisition, which by the late 1700s had become a symbol of brutal religious authoritarianism. It was here that many supposed heretics would be interrogated, tortured, and killed. A percentage of Afro-descendants and Indigenous people were punished here too, however, typically for acts of sorcery, witchcraft, and idolatry. Growing spiritual tensions were far from Nueva Granada's only prominent issues, however. Throughout the 1700s, external pressures such as contraband would persist in the region's port cities, and with Cartagena's stone walls still under construction, so too did the pirate raids. Another significant naval invasion would occur in 1741, when British Admiral Edward Vernon arrived with an unprecedented armada containing dozens of warships with up to 20,000 troops. Amazingly, the Grenadans, using a mix of fortification tactics and environmental warfare under the leadership of one-eyed Admiral Blas d'Alezo, eventually succeeded in repelling the British the following year. Whilst not publicised widely in Spain, the victory became a strong source of local pride for the Grenadans. With minimal assistance from Spain in the effort, it also proved to the colonies that they could both survive and triumph without constant oversight from Madrid. Even as military threats receded, however, Nueva Granada's local resilience would soon be tested by an onset of economic pressures. Later in 1778, the Spanish crown would introduce a policy of free trade across its American colonies. Whilst beneficial in bringing new markets to certain ports, such as Havana and Veracruz, the same could not be said for further southern regions such as Cartagena. With the arrival of cheaper European goods, local industries such as the textile producers of Santa Fe de Bogotá and Socorro simply could not compete. Thus, the sentiment would only continue to grow that local prosperity was being taken by distant imperial power. On top of this, Creoles were also becoming increasingly excluded from various institutions such as military command, high positions in government, and the church. Instead, Peninsulares, Spaniards born in Europe, would monopolise power, leaving even the most educated Creoles to feel like second-class citizens. Rather than give in to their grievances, however, the Creoles would fight to assert their importance and utility. This largely came in the form of an emerging Creole intellectual movement, where colleges such as San Bartolomé in Santa Fe de Bogotá would teach Enlightenment philosophy, nurturing a new generation who were critical of the monarchy and keen on shaping a sovereign society. Many of these Creoles would then join colonial militias, often alongside mixed-race individuals, where they would spread their Enlightenment ideals of equality, merit, and leadership. Spain, however, was not about to make their lives any easier. Another point of conflict came in 1780, when the crown would double taxes on both tobacco and aguardiente, a sugarcane-based liquor popular among the working class. Compounding the existing frustration of market disruption that free trade had caused, this new move would send locals over the edge. The following year, joint anger would give way to an uprising known as the Comunero Revolt, where tens of thousands of armed villagers across many social classes would march together in Santa Fe de Bogotá to demand justice and tax relief. Though a temporary truce was brokered, colonial authorities would then proceed to arrest, execute, and exile revolt leaders. Meanwhile, just over a decade later in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, another huge revolt would take place, this time a protest against the brutal slavery of African workers. Before long, it would erupt into a 13-year war that would go on to destroy one of the most lucrative colonial regimes in the world. The sheer scale of violence would soon catch the attention of Spanish officials in Nueva Granada, who feared the potential of similar uprisings within their own region's enslaved populations. Instead of making reforms, however, the Crown would continue to double down on its authoritative hold over the colony. Church lands were sold off to plug Spain's fiscal holes, taxes were raised to fund their wars against Britain and France, and with the region's promotion to viceroyalty a few decades prior, imperial control would only continue to tighten across the territory. Compounding all of this were the emerging Atlantic trade disruptions due to the French Revolution, which would cut off many large exports and imports, aggravating Creole merchants and landowners. With the rising economic pressure, many of the elite were forced to take out loans, sell off heirlooms, and, with the trade disruptions often affecting the import of African slaves, lean more heavily on local slaves. Ultimately, Spain's incessant meddling along with their blunders would stoke a strong anti-royalist sentiment among the Creole elite. This sentiment would become further exacerbated when the Crown issued a decree allowing for cédulas de gracias al sacar. This was a special license that could be purchased by mixed-race individuals, effectively granting them legal whiteness. This in turn would allow them to access many of the societal benefits that came with this caste, such as education, political office, and church positions. Many among the Creole elite were highly resentful towards this system, fearing that it would undermine their social status, particularly in the cities with large educated mixed-race populations. Perhaps even more alarming to the Creoles, though, was the Crown's enlisting of black and mixed-race men into local militias, along with new slave codes that would allow for Afro-descendants to legally appeal to the Crown for justice. These developments not only challenged the Creole sense of racial hierarchy, but also, with the growing autonomy and power of other ethnicities, made them fear for a revolt like the one in Saint Domingue, where many slave masters were massacred. On one hand, Creole hostility against the Crown had grown significantly, but on the other hand, there was a rising fear as to what may happen to them without Spain's support and protection, motivating many to stay loyal to the motherland. These opposing tensions would ultimately define much of the region's revolutionary journey moving forwards. Despite Spain's tight grip on its American colonies up until this point, the early 1800s would mark a major turning point on the path to independence. In 1805, Spain would be crushed by a British fleet during the Battle of Trafalgar, losing many of its key ships and experienced sailors. This in turn would weaken both Spain's ability to trade across the Atlantic and enforce its military presence overseas. The Crown's hold would further loosen during the French invasion, when Spain's King Ferdinand VII was forced to abdicate by Napoleon, who then installed his own brother on the throne. Ultimately, the extent of chaos in Spain, along with the increasingly severed communication, was taken by many Nueva Granadans as motivation to finally chart their own course separate from their volatile mother country. Local elites in Nueva Granada would begin to govern themselves more independently, forming their own militias, tax systems, and economies. Additionally, much of the region would even begin to identify as American rather than Spanish, signaling a shift not only in legal politics but cultural identity. The true watershed moment, however, came during an incident known as El Florero de Llorente, or Llorente's Vase, on July 20th, 1810. Essentially, a group of Creole patriots in Bogotá had orchestrated a conflict with a wealthy Spanish merchant, José González Llorente, a staunch royalist known for his arrogance. When asking to borrow a flower vase from him to, supposedly, decorate a reception for a visiting official, Llorente refused in such a manner that the Creoles viewed as insolent. Llorente's unjust attitude was then used as a pretext by the Creoles to incite public outrage among a nearby crowd. This tension would soon escalate into anti-Spanish sentiment, at which point arguments boiled over into raucous street protests. The Creoles would then use this civil unrest as evidence that the Spanish viceroy had lost control over the area, and that a local junta would be needed to maintain order and protect the public. So it was on this date, Nueva Granada's first local, non-royalist junta was formed. Whilst they initially claimed Spanish loyalty so as to avoid open rebellion, they would however exclude any Peninsular Spaniards from the body. With this event being historically viewed as the first official instance of a government without Spanish rule in the region, its date, July 20th, 1810, has since become recognised as Colombia's National Independence Day, observed annually to this day. With the formation of this body, the spark had been lit, and before long, many other juntas would emerge across other cities such as Cartagena, Popayan, and Tunja. From here, constitutional experiments would increasingly begin to reject monarchy to various capacities. To exactly what capacity the region should have its own autonomy, however, would become an area of dispute. Opposing philosophies would soon mark a stark point of division between regions, sowing the seeds of discord for over a century to come. For now, though, provinces unable to agree on their political vision would simply declare independence from each other. In an attempt to regain control of the chaos, some Creoles would attempt to form a loose federation known as the United Provinces of Nueva Granada. Several key provinces, however, would refuse to recognise their authority. Unable to reach a unified consensus, a civil war broke out. What had only recently been a movement against the monarchy had now turned into an uprising against each other. This era of Colombian history has since become known as the Patria Boba, or the Foolish Fatherland, in reference to how the region essentially sabotaged itself with infighting. Amidst the chaos of this dark hour, however, a new figure would emerge, one who would change the course of history forever. Simón Bolívar, born 1783, was a Venezuelan-born Creole from one of the region's wealthiest families. Orphaned at a young age following the deaths of his mother and father to tuberculosis, Bolívar would later move to Madrid. Here, from age 16 to 18, he'd complete his formal education, focusing on subjects of humanities such as history, literature, philosophy, and languages. A couple of years later, he travelled to France, where he'd immerse himself in the teachings of Enlightenment philosophers such as Rousseau, Voltaire, and Montesquieu, exposing him to what was considered radical political thought. It was here that Bolívar would also witness the coronation of Napoleon Bonaparte, something which both impressed and disturbed him. On one hand, Bonaparte's ability to mobilise national spirit and defend the French Revolution was remarkable to Bolívar, but on the other hand, his abuse of centralised power and betrayal of republican ideals cast a stern warning over the pitfalls of such a venture. Nevertheless, both Bonaparte and Bolívar's studies in philosophy were deeply influential to him, and by age 22 in 1805, disillusioned with the Spanish monarchy, he would famously vow to liberate Latin America from Spanish rule. After returning to Venezuela in 1807, Bolivar would eventually join the military in the struggle for independence, but by 1812 was forced into exile when Venezuela's republic collapsed under pressure from royalists. To this, he'd retreat from Venezuela to Curaçao, and later to Cartagena in Nueva Granada, which would become his new revolutionary stronghold. It was here that Bolivar later wrote his famous Cartagena Manifesto, issued in 1812, in which he would lay out why Venezuela's first republic had failed, along with a roadmap to avoid further such collapses. Upon arriving in Cartagena, Bolivar would start by offering his military services to the aforementioned United Provinces of Nueva Granada, who, once again, were attempting to bring together the fragmented juntas in a shared vision for independence. After being entrusted with a small military force, Bolivar would then be tasked with defending the southern border of the Cartagena province against royalists. Instead of staying passively on the defensive, however, Bolivar would go all out and launch an offensive campaign along the Magdalena River, where he would liberate local towns by driving out royalist forces. This streak of successes would earn Bolivar a brilliant reputation across rebellions in the region. His charisma, military discipline, and ability to inspire troops, meanwhile, soon set him apart as a strong revolutionary leader. With barely a moment to rest, Bolivar would then return to Venezuela that same year, launching his Admiral campaign, wherein, with the support of the United Provinces, he'd successfully liberate western Venezuela. Sadly, both royal resistance and a lack of popular support from non-elite sectors, however, would cause the republic to collapse again the following year. Meanwhile, in Nueva Granada, things weren't very much better. Civil wars between regional factions was still ongoing, and the United Provinces had denied Bolivar full command over their political body. Disillusioned with politics, he'd then resign his commission in 1815 and flee to Jamaica. Here, Bolivar would write his famous Jamaica letter, in which he'd articulate the unique challenges Nueva Granada faced, such as racial divisions, lack of experience in self-rule, and centuries of colonial exploitation. Most importantly, however, he'd share his vision for a new social order, a unified and independent Latin America rooted in justice. Evidently, this dream would become more important by the minute. That same year, a huge Spanish expeditionary force led by General Pablo Morillo would land in Santa Marta before quickly moving to place Cartagena and Bogotá under siege. The Viceroyalty of Nueva Granada was re-established, while many liberal rebels were executed or imprisoned and their institutions dismantled. Bolivar, however, was far from done. To the backdrop of Spain's reconquest, he'd regroup with a daring plan, involving the recruitment of British mercenaries. Specifically, these were seasoned veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, known as the British Legion, or the Bataillon Albion as Bolivar renamed them. Together, they would embark on one of the boldest military campaigns in the history of the Americas. The idea was to launch an attack on the Royalists where they were most vulnerable, and in a way they least expected. Since the Royalists were largely imagining an assault from the Venezuelan coast, Bolivar therefore devised a different strategy, an approach from the Llanos Plains and Andes Mountains into Boyacá. This was not something the Royalists would expect at all. The Llanos Plains were generally considered natural barriers, while the Andes contained flooded rivers, high altitudes, and sub-zero temperatures. Even less expected was that anyone would cross it during the wet season when movement was near impossible. Yet, for the pure element of surprise, this is exactly what Bolivar would do. In 1819, he'd embark on the treacherous campaign with his troops, comprised of Creole patriots, Llanero horsemen, and the British Legion. The journey took them through swamps, freezing highlands, and near impassable terrain, with many dying of altitude sickness and exhaustion. Those who survived, however, would emerge in the plain of Pantano de Vargas, where they would fight a crucial battle against Royalist troops on July 25th. Their hard-earned victory would be vital in weakening the Royalists and their defense of Bogotá. It was not, however, the most decisive battle. That came 13 days later, on August 7th, 1819, when Bolivar and his troops would arrive at the Boyacá Bridge. It was here that the campaign culminated in its final battle against Spanish forces. After just 2 hours, a victory was secured, thereby cutting off Royalist control of Bogotá and liberating the region. Yet, even after all this, Bolivar wasn't ready to retire. On the contrary, the victory in Boyacá would mark a turning point from a local rebellion into a coordinated war for continental liberation. Essential to this mission was a bold proposal Bolivar would present to Congress in Bogotá, the creation of a new Latin American republic known as Gran Colombia, or Great Colombia. Named after Christopher Columbus, or Cristobal Colón in Spanish, this republic would unify the territory of Nueva Granada with Venezuela along with Ecuador. This proposal was very quickly accepted, and in 1821, Bolivar was elected the republic's first constitutional president. Meanwhile, a young 29-year-old general named Francisco de Paula Santander was chosen by Bolivar as vice president. Due to his legal background and bureaucratic tendencies, however, Santander would be nicknamed by Bolivar El Hombre de las Leyes, or the Man of the Laws, a title that would only prove more apt as time went on. Santander played a crucial role in establishing administrative structures such as lawmaking, tax reform, and civil institutions, vital to the functioning of the Republic. Bolivar, meanwhile, would continue to focus on military campaigns across South America, marking an important balance between liberation and establishment. Gradually, however, a rift would build between the two due to the contrast in political vision. For starters, the Wars of Independence had come with a heavy cost, pushing the nation into a debt about 5 times its annual revenue. This concerned Santander deeply, but compounding the crisis were Bolivar's constant demands for military funding and aid, much to Santander's frustration. One notable disagreement came when Bolivar requested the emancipation of goldfield workers in Choco and Cauca so that he could enlist them into his army. To this, Santander, acting president while Bolivar was away, adamantly refused, appealing to the importance of gold production for the economy's survival. Beyond slavery and the economy, another point of contention would arise when Bolivar pushed for constitutional changes that would allow for lifelong presidency, along with presidential power to choose a successor. Looking to Napoleon as an example, he argued that the chaos of the region could only be contained under a strong, centralized leadership. Once again though, Santander strongly opposed this, as did many others who felt this model reeked of a dictatorship or monarchy. Still, Bolivar's ideals were not the only source of controversy for the Colombianos. Santander would also find himself facing his own battles, especially with the church. Inspired by Enlightenment philosophy, his early efforts to regulate church influence in education, introduce secular philosophy into schools, and raise the age for taking religious vows would soon find sharp opposition within the Catholic hierarchy, particularly in areas such as Popayan and Tunja, where the church had historically held enormous influence. Adding to this, his attempts to sell unused monasteries, along with the fact that many in his cabinet were Freemasons, and it wasn't long before Santander's government was being denounced straight from the pulpit, his decisions framed as an attack on faith and tradition. Eventually, clerics would outright refuse to comply with civil regulations he'd imposed over the church, marking a division that would last long into the future. Meanwhile, on an international level, the Republic also wasn't faring any better. Financially, the nation had borrowed a large loan of nearly £7 million from Britain, but were failing to pay the interest the loan entailed. To make matters worse, the British bond market would later collapse in 1825 and 26, completely blocking Gran Colombia's access to further credit. After the collapse, British merchants and diplomats would soon begin pressuring the Republic to pay up, threatening to seize custom revenues should they fail to do so. Unfortunately, this was simply not possible in their current economic state. Credit access had collapsed and unemployment was on a sharp rise, particularly in the port cities such as Cartagena and Santa Marta. At the same time, political tensions would continue to stir up the nation. Over in Bogotá, some Venezuelan troops stationed during Bolivar's absence would become quite the point of contention among the locals. The troops had an open disdain for Santander, viewing him as overly legalistic and elitist compared to the battle-worn Bolivar, whom they had deep respect for. The brash way in which they expressed this sentiment, however, was not received well at all by the Nueva Granadans, who themselves, similar to Santander, often placed high value on discipline and order, at least until things reached a breaking point. In this instance, such a breaking point would come when one of these officers was accused, truthfully or not, of executing a Nueva Granadan. Tensions were already high, but these allegations would tip the Nueva Granadans over the edge, motivating them to press for a public execution, which ultimately went through. If nothing else, the episode highlighted the severe disunity that was growing throughout both politics and regular civilians in the region. This conflict was not, however, merely confined to Nueva Granada. Over in Venezuela, locals were also resentful over the interference of distant political elites that Bolivar had placed under his central authority. Such regional loyalties and interstate conflict would soon become prevalent across Gran Colombia, and before long would begin to outweigh the collective desire for a unified republic. Another flashpoint occurred in 1826, when Bolivar would dismiss a Venezuelan general, José Antonio Páez, from his command. Páez was a highly beloved military leader in Venezuela due to his strong involvement in the Wars of Independence, so the news of his firing was not taken lightly. Following his dismissal, Páez would stage a revolt, mobilizing his many Venezuelan supporters in an uprising. Foreign authorities from Nueva Granada were expelled from government and replaced with Páez's own, while central government orders from Nueva Granada to hand over his Venezuelan militias were completely disobeyed. Interestingly, Páez and his followers denied that he was rebelling against Bolivar, rather framing it as a regional defense of federal rights over a declaration of independence. True or not, the uprising would have drastic effects on the rest of the Republic, with other regions following up with their own movements. These revolts would give rise to the concept of regional caudillos, military leaders who'd use their power to control politics. Unfortunately, this would become a common theme throughout the century. To address the growing unrest, Bolivar would first act by granting Páez a sweeping amnesty in an attempt to pacify him. Then, in a desperate measure to regain control over the Republic, Bolivar would sign a decree that effectively granted him dictatorial powers. Among these changes were the abolishment of vice presidency, a limit on legislative oversight, and most importantly, the ability to govern by executive decree. Despite being intended as a temporary measure, these changes would be met with fierce opposition, who feared this new constitution would become permanent. Violence boiled over, and in 1828, a failed attempt to assassinate Bolivar was even staged. In the aftermath, Santander would be arrested for his alleged knowledge of the scheme, if not direct involvement. Despite a lack of definitive evidence, his outspoken opposition to Bolivar's new constitution made him an easy target. Though spared from an execution, Santander would ultimately be sent into exile, deprived of his vice presidency. By this point, Bolivar had become physically and emotionally exhausted. He'd recently developed severe health issues, most likely tuberculosis, while continuing to deal with incessant uprisings. Things would hit an all-time low, however, when Venezuela officially seceded from Gran Colombia in 1830, followed by Ecuador later that same year. Bolivar's dream of a single continental republic was in ruins. By 1830, devastated and worn down, he'd therefore decide to resign from the presidency and his war campaigns, with plans to retire in Europe. Before he could do this, however, Bolivar would face one final emotional blow: the assassination of his most trusted lieutenant, close friend, and preferred presidential successor, Antonio José de Sucre. This was the ultimate devastation for Bolivar, who reportedly stated, "They have killed Abel, now there is no more faith in man." With his health further deteriorating, likely a result of this anguish he now held for his friend, Bolivar would then decide that it was no longer feasible to make the voyage to Europe. On the brink of death, he'd instead withdraw to a quiet estate near Santa Marta. There, he'd pass away on December 17, 1830, destroyed by the failures of the republic he'd fought to build. His final writings would further demonstrate the tragedy of his plight, stating, "He who serves a revolution ploughs the sea." Both loved and despised by many, his death would mark the end of an era. The long struggle for identity across the former nations of Gran Colombia, however, was only just beginning. Following Gran Colombia's collapse, the remaining land of modern-day Colombia and Panama would be officially renamed to La República de la Nueva Granada, or the Republic of New Granada, in 1832. Besides this new title, however, the region was facing a huge crisis of identity. With Venezuela and Ecuador gone and Bolivar passed on, many important questions would arise over the direction of this new republic. Would it be federal or centralized, civilian-led or militaristic, religious or secular? These tensions would become the cornerstone of many political debates moving forwards. For now, though, the country was still reeling from years of civil strife, which had severely impacted its economic landscape. Industries such as agriculture and mining had all but ground to a halt. Port cities such as Cartagena and Santa Marta, meanwhile, would lose their once vital prominence in international trade, with foreign merchants hesitant to embrace a region so rife with instability. Incidentally, the mass collapse of industry would contribute to the emancipation of many enslaved labourers. Without any lands or means of survival, though, a large portion of these individuals would simply become displaced. With the onset of an industry and government power vacuum, this era would also see many military veterans from the wars of independence leap at the opportunity for wealth and influence over the region. Not intent on fading into obscurity, they'd soon seize control over a great portion of local trade and land, eventually even entering the realm of political leadership. Their military prowess, however, would rarely translate into administrative competence. Instead, a culture of clientelism would emerge, where battlefield accomplishments were favoured over political experience, and nepotism and favouritism were commonplace. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church in the region would soon see the loss of official recognition from the Vatican due to a string of anti-clerical reforms passed by the new government, more on that new government in a bit, that had stripped it from traditional privileges. Despite this, the church would maintain a hold over many important societal institutions, such as marriage and education, upholding itself as the moral backbone of the struggling republic. Many clerics would also come to fill a vacuum in governmental roles, often within judicial institutions and village councils, where they could exert a great influence. On a larger scale, the aftermath of Bolivar's death would see the rise of two opposing political visions for the nation. From Bolivar's followers, the push was for a highly centralized government that could exert control over the region as needed. On the other side, however, were the supporters of Santander, who advocated for a decentralized government and stronger autonomy among individual regions. These competing visions would see the country divided, with ideological loyalties differing starkly between departments. The capital department of Cundinamarca, for instance, unsurprisingly advocated for a centralist government that could exert control over the nation, whilst local elites in other regions, such as Valle de Cauca and the Caribbean coast, favoured a federalist approach. For now, at least, it would seem that the latter camp had the upper hand. Santander, with the support of his followers, had recently returned from exile and assumed the presidency in 1832. Almost immediately after regaining office, Santander would implement a number of national reforms aimed at reducing state militarism and transforming the nation into a more liberal and secular society. Namely, these included reducing the army's share of the national budget by around a quarter, along with introducing philosophical teachings and beliefs to universities that were not based in or necessarily compatible with Catholicism, something which he had hoped would drive immigration from non-Catholic countries. Despite these ambitions, however, much of Santander's reputation would ultimately be thwarted by contentions over the country's staggering debt. In an attempt to improve the situation, Santander would try diversifying the economy beyond its gold and tobacco output, sadly to little success. With a lack of capital, major infrastructure projects such as roadways and river transport therefore would be put aside, fueling further discontent from the opposition. In addition to this, fractures would soon begin to grow out of Santander's moderate ideological standing. Appealing to his secular reforms whilst also trying to appease the church would prove quite the balancing act and would ultimately lead only to greater division. On one hand, urban liberals wanted faster modernization in society, but rural elites and clergy were afraid that such reforms would erode their traditional authority. Santander's struggle in not upsetting either side would result in a kind of institutional inertia, viewed by many as an absence of strong leadership. Not long after Santander's term ended, the country would experience its first war since the Wars of Independence, La Guerra de los Supremos, or the War of the Supremes, from 1839 to 1842. The spark for this war came from a new law passed by Santander's successor, President José Ignacio de Marquez. The highly controversial reform would order the closing of certain temples and convents so they could be auctioned off and used for secular purposes, such as schools. In response, a group of regional leaders known as Supremos would revolt, under the motive of protecting religious freedom. As time went on though, this motive evolved into a mere pretext, an excuse to reject centralized authority and thereby expand their own regional power. The civil war that arose from this conflict would see the Supremos tear through entire towns that were centralist loyalists. Many of the male farmers in these areas, meanwhile, were either drafted into militias or fled to avoid conscription, which would have a drastic effect on agricultural cycles, leading to both food shortages and inflation. The war would thankfully come to an end by 1842, thanks to the methodical defeat of many rebel factions under President Pedro Alcántara Herrán. Even still, the discourse surrounding church-state relations and federalism more broadly would leave the country deeply fractured for years to come. Throughout this era, Colombia was also experiencing a great territorial expansion, with many settlements populating interior regions in particular, such as Antioquia, Tolima, and the Coffee Axis. As with the Civil War, however, this expansion came with its share of violent displacements. Peasant communities would often be violently uprooted in order to make way for larger developments, while land titles granted to the military and urban elites would push indigenous and Afro-descendant communities away into marginal areas. Whilst many of these colonization projects were promoted as a means of national integration, the results were often the complete opposite, giving way to both local rebellions and coercive systems of labor. Meanwhile, on a philosophical front, Colombia would experience a wave of new political ideology throughout the following decades of the century, influenced mainly by popular thought from the French Revolution. Many of the utopian ideas of the time took the country by storm, even seeing constitutional amendments drafted as a result. Perhaps the most transformative of these reforms was the abolition of slavery in 1851, which would see the liberation of up to 25,000 Afro-Colombians. Though the act of official emancipation itself was an undeniable triumph, unfortunately very few material benefits would follow for the liberated. Without any compensation or land, many of these individuals would simply find themselves continuing to work in the same exploitative labour arrangements as before, just to make ends meet. This era of liberal reform under the now liberal government went far beyond slave emancipation, however. On a broader level, the liberal revolution could be viewed largely as a concerted effort to, once again, secularise the country by curbing the church's authority over society. This included the secularisation of education, the introduction of civil marriage, and even some radical democratic experiments for the time. In 1853, for instance, women in the small town of Vélez were briefly given the right to vote, one of the earliest known instances of female suffrage in the world. Such experiments were a true testament to the intellectual fervour of the time, with revolutionary liberal doctrines being spread far and wide. Even still, traditional ideologies persisted, particularly when it came to the subject of racial hierarchy. Despite being emancipated, Afro-Colombians, for instance, were often subject to racist presuppositions that viewed them as an issue to be rectified. One example of this was in how the ruling white class looked down on these communities due to their supposed excessive breeding. To solve this alleged issue, the white elite would promote a policy known as blanqueamiento, or whitening. This was a movement that encouraged interbreeding between white and Afro-Colombian individuals so as to dilute black cultural influence in the offspring and allow white culture to permeate. Sadly, these pseudoscientific practices would remain entrenched for decades, even into the 20th century. Such racist attitudes could also be seen very clearly in certain census records and official documents of the time, which often omitted black racial categories or redefined them using euphemistic terms such as mestizo in order to downplay black heritage. Meanwhile, traditional African cultural expressions such as drumming, dance, and oral storytelling were framed as backward and would be suppressed by the ruling class. Sadly, indigenous communities would hardly fare any better. Their ancestral rescados, areas that legally protected indigenous self-governance, would be gradually eroded amidst the aforementioned territorial expansion, once again in the name of national integration. This, of course, would leave many landless, only adding to the ever-expanding list of displaced people. Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities were not the only marginalised peoples during this era, however. The Jesuits, who'd attempted to return to the country since their initial expulsion in 1767, would find themselves being expelled a second time in 1861 under the broader liberal reforms that were sweeping the nation during the time. As mentioned earlier, the broader goal of these reforms was to reduce the Catholic Church's influence over society, an effort that culminated in a complete rewriting of the Constitution in 1853 by the Liberal government. In this transformative document, church and state were officially separated. Beyond religion, the new constitution also stripped the president's authority to elect regional governors, marking a huge step towards decentralization. Although this direction may have appeared contradictory to the Liberals' early ideals of a centralized state, there was some strategy behind it. Namely, this decentralization was less a change in the Liberals' inherent ideology and more of a practical device used to weaken the entrenched ecclesiastical power of the Catholic Church, which had become deeply embedded into national institutions up until this point. By enabling local governors to be chosen by provincial assemblies instead of the president, it meant that there was no longer a centralist interference that could enforce religious orthodoxy. In turn, this allowed for the potential of regional governors who aligned with more secular or progressive ideals. Although many liberals championed the reforms, their government was far from unified. Many within their camp would disagree on both the scope and pace of the reform, leading to severe ideological fragmentation. This in turn left their party unstable and vulnerable to any unified opposition. Conservatives, meanwhile, were watching this unfold to great disgust. To them, the reforms were perceived not as some simple, inconsequential policy changes, but rather an all-out assault on traditional beliefs and morality fundamental to the nation. Decentralization was also viewed as a potential threat to traditional provincial hierarchies of which conservative influence relied on. Such frustration, however, extended well beyond the conservatives. As it happened, a group of disgruntled liberal rivals known as the Sociedades Democráticas were also upset with the current government. As a group comprised of artisans, their chief concern, however, had little to do with religious reform and more to do with the government's laissez-faire trade policies, of which they felt undercut local artisan livelihoods. With the government fragile from ideological disarray, however, these rival liberals saw a window of opportunity for a power grab. The following year, in 1854, they therefore conduct a military coup under General José María Melo, overthrowing Liberal President José María Obando and propelling Melo into a dictatorship over the country. This, of course, did not go down well. In retaliation, many conservatives and liberals who view the dictatorship as illegitimate would form a coalition against the regime aiming to overthrow Melo. Before long, their efforts would spark a civil war that lasted months, until they finally managed to defeat Melo in December 1854. From here, a couple of liberal and conservative leaders would serve as acting presidents until 1857, at which point conservative leader Mariano Ospina Rodriguez would assume office as the winner of a national election. The following year, Ospina would go on to officially rename the country La Confederación Granadina, or the Granadine Confederation, under a new constitution. In an ironic turn of events, his government would also embrace federalism, the very thing the conservatives had fought against when the liberals were in. The reasoning, however, was largely strategic. Despite the conservative regeneration, the reality was that the liberal political class had not been fully purged from the national government. Enabling federalism, therefore, would help to restrict these liberals' secular influence over the provinces. It would also, however, continue to divide an already disjointed republic, giving rise to regional strongmen known as caudillos. These ruthless men, often ex-military officers, would seize control over territories, often disregarding national laws and mandates. From this, different regions would develop their own distinct legal norms, militias, and even tax codes. The national government, meanwhile, with its diminishing tax revenue, lack of a unified army, and dwindling legal influence, would weaken significantly. Just as with the Liberals before, this made the Conservative government vulnerable to a takeover, which once again is exactly what happened. In 1860, military general and former Liberal president Tomás Cipriano de Mosquera launched a civil war against the Confederation, which would ultimately see him seize control of the government. Despite declaring himself dictator, however, Mosquera was also a strong federalist, even more so than the previous government, in fact. Though this may seem contradictory, Mosquera viewed his dictatorship more as a means to an end, namely, to more effectively help him dismantle authoritarian structures. Despite the previous conservative government's push for federalism, Mosquera felt that they hadn't gone far enough. To further this goal, he'd sign into law a new constitution in 1863 in which he'd found Los Estados Unidos de Colombia, or the United States of Colombia. In this new constitution, each state would gain almost total sovereignty. Many independent services, such as the aforementioned tax systems and armies between regions, would be legally formalised, along with other institutions such as suffrage laws. Perhaps the most interesting reforms of the new constitution, however, came on the level of individual rights. Some notable changes included the abolition of the death penalty, the enshrinement of free speech, and the right to both bear and trade arms. Importantly, these rights weren't just ideals for Mosquera's government, they were considered vital safeguards against the potential for centralised tyranny. Though these rights were transformative for society in many important ways, however, the broader push for deeper federalism would once again come at a steep cost. The onset of autonomous power within the now semi-sovereign states would quickly be abused by local governors who'd often evolve into de facto warlords or dictators, entrenching their own personal rule. Another impactful facet of decentralization, meanwhile, came in the form of secularization. This did not, however, stem from anti-religious sentiment, but rather a desire for free communication of ideas, beneficial for both believers and non-believers alike. To this end, the Church's deep institutional power and influence was viewed as a crucial obstacle to overcome. To both weaken the Church's grip and assist in paying off public debt that had compiled due to the weak national tax system, the government would begin auctioning off huge areas of Church-owned land. Oftentimes, they'd significantly devalue these estates, selling them for a fraction of their real value. Although mildly successful from a fiscal perspective, this practice also came with some unintentional consequences. Namely, an influx of liberal-aligned buyers who'd now become landowners, and the resulting displacement of peasant families who lived and worked on church lands for generations. Even still, the church, despite its diminished political power, would remain a powerful social force. This was especially the case among the rural poor, who'd further championed traditional values since viewing liberalism as the cause for their displacements. Overall, the Liberal government did gain some economic traction during their tenure, however this would be short-lived. Following a steep drop in global tobacco prices, one of the nation's main exports at the time, the United States of Colombia would find itself in a deep fiscal crisis. The government's solution of, once again, selling off church land meanwhile, was not exactly helping public perception. This growing discontent, particularly among conservatives, would quickly build in tension, sending President Mosquera into desperation over holding his position. In 1867, he would even go as far as dissolving Congress in an attempt to rule by decree. This, of course, was seen as a huge betrayal of principles by his supporters and opponents alike. Within a few months, Mosquera would therefore be forcibly removed from office, exposing the major internal tensions within the Liberal government. Still, the Liberal reforms would continue under the remaining Liberal government, now led by Provisional President Santos Acosta. One notable area of their progressive vision was in public education. Beyond founding a public national university, the government also made elementary school free and compulsory. Within these state-run schools, a new national curriculum would then be established, which enforced religious neutrality and emphasized scientific reasoning where possible. In some regions, clergy would even be banned from teaching positions at schools, with religious content being replaced by natural sciences and positivist philosophy. This, of course, caused stark outrage for conservative families who felt their traditional values were being undermined. Even the Pope at the time condemned the curriculum, which would further affirm the backlash. Eventually, the situation would reach a melting point when conservative regional leaders, clergy, and disillusioned citizens began to stage armed revolts in protest. One of these would even spiral into a civil war lasting almost a year, simply known as the Colombian Civil War of 1876 to 1877. Eventually, a compromise was reached thanks to the election of a moderate Liberal president viewed as somewhat acceptable to both sides of the political fence. Initially appointed in 1880 for a 2-year term before returning in 1884, President Rafael Núñez was known largely for his pragmatism. Though interested in modernization, he also valued order and stability over senseless radical idealism. In a nutshell, Núñez's main initiative was to re-centralize the government and re-establish church presence. By 1886, this vision would culminate in a constitutional rewrite so robust that it would remain in force for almost a century. The reforms were numerous. Regional autonomy was rolled back significantly in favour of a central unitary state, presidents were given the power to appoint and have greater control over regional governors and mayors, and presidential terms were extended from 2 to 6 years. In terms of the church-state relation, the new constitution re-established Catholicism as the official state religion once again. Furthering this positive relationship with the church, Núñez would also offer compensation to churches whose land had previously been confiscated under the aforementioned land auctioning, and even welcomed back the Jesuits to the country. Much to the delight of conservatives, public school curricula would also see itself realigned with traditional church doctrine. Meanwhile, as with previous constitutions, Núñez's rewrite would also give the nation a new name, this time La República de Colombia, or the Republic of Colombia. Ultimately, the reforms of this constitution were highly transformative for the nation, though they were far from the only impactful developments of the decade. The country would also undergo significant economic evolution, including the founding of a national bank in 1880, a surge of land privatization, and an expansion of railroad construction. Easily the largest development, though, was the boom in the nation's coffee economy, which saw roughly tripled exports between 1878 and 1892 due to a rise in international coffee prices. This cemented the Republic of Colombia as a Latin American epicenter for coffee exports, alongside Brazil and Costa Rica. The boom would soon reshape the labor landscape, and the literal landscape, throughout entire regions, particularly the Andean interior. Antioquia and Caldas, for instance, would see a rapid expansion of migrant labor, though sadly, often under harsh conditions and with minimal legal protection. Despite such a sudden economic boom, the country would take a sudden turn, however, when Núñez passed away in 1894. Upon his death, Vice President Miguel Antonio Caro would assume the presidency. Unlike Núñez, though, Caro was a staunch conservative and far more of an ideological traditionalist. This, along with his comparative lack of political finesse, would soon become cause for tension among the liberals. Under Caro, their leaders would be pushed out of office, their newspapers censored, and their coffee farm strongholds often excluded from important state investments, causing liberal power to rapidly deteriorate throughout the remainder of the decade. Beyond elite strongholds, meanwhile, liberal-aligned regions in general would often receive little public investment, with Caro instead favouring conservative regions for vital infrastructure projects such as roads and schools. Perhaps one of the most contentious developments, however, was Caro's infamous tax on coffee exports. This was implemented as a direct reaction to the immense economic growth of liberal landowners and their recent push for more control over regional revenue and trade policy. These pushes for reform deeply concerned Caro, who was suspicious that the elites were organising a rebellion under the guise of economic autonomy. Even if this were true, though, the coffee tax he'd subsequently imposed would severely weaken the stability of the situation. Beyond infuriating the liberals, the resulting crippled trade would also contribute to a wider economic downturn. In a state of panic, Caro would later ease the coffee tax and, most notably, expand the supply of currency. Though intended to amend the economy, this latter measure would, however, end up contributing to a huge increase in inflation, dramatically decreasing the value of the peso in exchange markets. To this, wages stagnated and food prices soared. As discord surrounding economic mismanagement grew, urban protests would then erupt in major cities. Rather than enact reforms, however, Caro would turn to damage control. Vocal opposition leaders would be jailed, liberal-aligned newspapers shut down, and emergency powers expanded. Though this crackdown managed to temporarily silence dissent in the capital, its effect elsewhere was a different story. By now, even some conservatives were distancing themselves from Caro, uneasy with his authoritarianism and inability to manage the economy. Despite some common ground between liberal and conservative moderates, however, radical division elsewhere would ultimately prevail. The final straw of this conflict were the results of an 1898 presidential election, which saw a new conservative president, Manuel Antonio Saclemente, take power. Though Caro was out, many viewed Saclemente's presidency as a mere continuation of his regime, in large part due to allegations of electoral fraud at Caro's hands. These tensions eventually gave way to a rebellion beginning in 1899 that became known as La Guerra de los Mil Días, or the Thousand Days War. As the name suggests, it lasted 1,000 days and saw between an estimated 100,000 and 120,000 people die from either violence or disease, making it one of the most brutal conflicts in Colombia's history. The war saw liberals engage in guerrilla warfare, while conservatives formed paramilitary groups in retaliation, killing mercilessly without fair trial. Much of this turmoil took place in regional villages, where both guerrilla and paramilitary groups demanded allegiance from villagers and killed those who were suspected of opposing. For their own safety, many villagers would also be forced to conscript into these armies. Beyond this, the conflict would also lead to mass displacements across the country, with many being forced to evacuate to escape the danger. As entire towns were burned, crops and vital infrastructure destroyed, and civilian homes looted for supplies, the influx of displaced people moving into the comparatively safer cities would soon swell beyond capacity. This population boom would severely strain vital state services such as sanitation, water supply, and housing, which, along with a widespread famine caused by destroyed food crops, would soon give way to disease. Bogotá, for instance, would see infant mortality reach as high as 25% and life expectancy drop as low as 30 and under. Eventually, by October 1902, the war would come to an end, with the better supplied conservatives emerging victorious in battle over the now materially exhausted liberals. To this, a ceasefire treaty known as the Treaty of Neerlandia would be signed, before a definitive final surrender treaty known as the Treaty of Wisconsin was ratified on conservative terms the following month. Although the treaty guaranteed amnesty for rebel combatants, affected families would be left with no compensation. The treaty also offered little in the way of underlying structural reform. The root causes of the war, such as partisan exclusion, centralized power, and land inequality, would remain unresolved. In 1903, just 1 year after the peace treaty was signed, Colombia would receive an offer from Theodore Roosevelt, who wanted to rent their planned canal in Panama for 99 years in exchange for both annual and immediate payment. To this, the Colombian government profusely refused. The country was still reeling from the effects of the Thousand Days' War, and under such uncertain times, they were hesitant to sign away sovereignty over such a strategically important asset. The canal, however, was far from the only part of the nation up for grabs. In fact, over in Panama, many Panamanians were seeking complete independence from the country, in large part due to discontentment over the Colombian government's suppression of canal construction by foreign companies. Many also felt that their region was often neglected from national affairs and treated as a mere backwater by the government in Bogotá. Taking note of this tension, the US government, meanwhile, would use the region's desire for independence to their advantage, pledging to support Panamanian revolutionaries in their liberation in exchange for control of the canal. When Panama rebels forcibly declared independence in 1903, therefore, the US would station warships off Panama's coast so as to prevent suppression from the Colombian military. This strategy was ultimately successful and would see Panama become a republic that same year, while the US government gained control over the construction of the canal along with its operation upon completion in 1914. This loss was a huge humiliation for Colombia and fostered a resentment towards the United States that would linger for decades to come. In the following year of 1904, conservative Rafael Reyes, the former chief of staff of Colombia's National Army, was elected as president. Reyes was known as a highly pragmatic leader, led by both his experience in the military and in international business. He ran on the mottos of peace, harmony, and work, and less politics and more administration, and strongly believed in the importance of industrial progress. He was also very open to working with liberals, a couple of whom he added to his cabinet, much to the dismay of some of his fellow party members. A few months into his presidency, Reyes received notice that the House of Representatives could not sustain its constitutional duties due to a lack of members showing up to meetings following a boycott from the Liberal Party in the 1904 election. To this, Reyes closed Congress and called for an election of a constitutional assembly, which was voted in. The body of the assembly would consist of loyal conservatives and moderate liberals who supported Reyes' vision of modernization and strong executive power. This shift in politics would help consolidate a more centralized executive power within the government, setting a precedent for future leaders. During his time in office, Reyes made some drastic reforms and progress, such as significantly strengthening the Colombian peso, almost parrying the US dollar, restoring relations with Venezuela, creating a network of highways, and expanding the railway network. He also made a guarantee that minority groups would see greater representation in future elections. Perhaps most notably though, in a move to secure economic growth by introducing US companies into Colombia, Reyes would secure Boston's United Fruit Company to produce plantations of bananas in the department of Magdalena. This deal had grave ramifications as it granted the company huge influence over the region, including extensive land rights along with tax exemptions. Effectively, the company would operate as an autonomous state within a state, later leading to significant labour conflicts and exploitation, but more on that later. As mentioned earlier, tensions between Colombia and the US would persist throughout the era due to their hand in liberating Panama from the country. Reyes, however, would seek to quell these tensions via a treaty of reconciliation, something which was eventually accepted by the US but caused much protest in Colombia from both conservatives and liberals. Many viewed the treaty as a betrayal of national sovereignty and nothing less than a complete compromise. In an attempt to quell the escalating tension against him, Reyes quietly resigned. Still, the treaty offer would not be withdrawn. The Colombian government, in an attempt to speed the process along, would even attempt to exercise leverage over the US by cancelling their various concessions of petroleum. Around this same time, the US, perhaps in part due to the prospect of losing their Colombian oil supply, would propose another treaty that offered Colombia $25 million in exchange for acceptance of Panama's independence. Known as the Thompson-Urrutia Treaty, the deal was signed in 1914 but wouldn't be ratified until 1921. With a whole 7 years gone by, the money felt to many less like compensation and more like an obligatory act of diplomacy to restore relations between the countries. In the following year of 1922, Pedro Ospina Vázquez was elected as president. Ospina's presidency could largely be viewed as a part of a broader technocratic movement that was sweeping the continent at the time, where leaders seek foreign capital and expertise to help modernize and stabilize their economies. For Ospina specifically, this would involve rousing interest from the US for investments in Colombia, something of which he was very successful in. Many from the US came to invest in emerald and gold mines, sugar and banana plantations, and in oil. At the recommendation of the US Secretary of State, Charles Evan Hughes, Ospina also invited a US economist, Edward W. Kemmerer, as an advisor to improve the country's financial situation. Kemmerer, who would later become known as the Money Doctor due to his successes, would implement a number of transformative initiatives, such as founding a central bank that operated in the open market and advocating the strengthening of investor protections, aiming to bolster Colombia's image for Wall Street financiers. By the end of Ospina's presidency in 1926, he had achieved radical economic reform, bringing Colombia into the 20th century through some of the best financial management in all of Latin America. This, along with his aid in rousing a huge influx of investment from the US, which became known as the Dance of Millions, caused a huge economic boom in the country, giving way to a dramatic increase in infrastructural development, including railways and the first commercial airline in Latin America in 1919. With this boom also came the rise of a new urban middle class, particularly in major cities such as Bogotá, Medellín, and Barranquilla, which would see rapid expansion under the inflow of foreign capital. Later, in 1927, a trade association known as the Federación Nacional de Cafeteros, or FEDECAFE, was formed to promote Colombia's coffee production and exports. Today, you may know this organization by their recognizable marketing campaign, Juan Valdez, a fictional character created as a label to denote coffee that's been 100% cultivated in Colombia. Even before the creation of the Juan Valdez brand in 1958, however, FEDECAFE was hugely successful in promoting local coffee farmers. Soon after its inception, it would become a unified framework for thousands of growers, helping them to negotiate better prices and set vital quality control standards in the international market. Under FEDECAFE, Colombia's coffee exports would triple within the first few decades of the 20th century, providing a lucrative source of income for many farmers. In 1932, a census reported that there were around 150,000 coffee farms in the country, also aided by a sudden increase in the country's population, many of whom would become farmers. Many of these farms were small, less than 25 acres, but these smaller plantations were still accountable for around 75% of crops. This influence of smallholder farming was a rare phenomenon in Latin America at the time, as it differed starkly to other countries where large estates often dominated the market. Both the coffee and population boom would also have negative effects, however. The rise of population, for one, would result in a deficiency of running water in major cities such as Bogotá, which at one point in the late 20s was only available to 5% of the population. Meanwhile, the coffee boom meant that many labourers and a large portion of the country's land were occupied for coffee exports, along with other exports driven by the country's sudden foreign investment, leaving little room for farmers to cultivate crops to feed their own population. The increasing number of rural Colombians displaced by the coffee industry's land occupancy, meanwhile, would then be forced to migrate to urban centres in search of work, thereby straining the infrastructure of the rapidly growing cities. With neighbourhoods becoming increasingly overcrowded and public health systems overwhelmed by the population boom, it wasn't long before serious diseases such as cholera, typhoid, and dysentery began to spread. At this point, the country would find itself in a serious health crisis, with figures showing an average of 1 in 5 infants dying within a year of their lives. Labour conditions and wages, meanwhile, were also terrible during this time. Many, including women and children, worked under abysmal conditions, in part due to the despotic nature of the US companies that often employed them, who were powerful enough to crush many of their labour rights. One such example of this was the Tropical Oil Company, or Troco, who operated under great impunity. Making matters worse was the blind submission of Colombian authorities, who were dependent on foreign capital and therefore didn't want to risk diplomatic fallout. For the workers of Troco, however, it was a different story. Discontent with such terrible work conditions and low wages, they eventually would decide to strike, only to be fired on by army troops. This incident in particular roused the attention of a now famous Medellín writer and journalist, Maria Cano. Spurring her to become a social activist, she would soon start a library where she'd conduct readings to raise awareness of cultural issues among labourers. In just a couple of years, Cano became hugely influential among workers across the country. This was in large part thanks to her numerous rallies, where she would represent the Revolutionary Socialist Party and demand for better working conditions. The Conservative government, however, saw her as a threat due to the tense fervour she'd ignited among labourers all over the country, and swiftly acted by passing a law that took away the individual rights of labour organisers. Still, in spite of this crackdown, Cano's speeches would continue to draw thousands of listeners, while her writings saw wide underground circulation. Meanwhile, one of Colombia's most famous labour organisation efforts, namely for the banana workers at the United Fruit Company in Ciénaga, Magdalena, would soon give way to one of the country's most historic massacres. In late 1928, 25,000 workers struck over low pay that often only took the form of vouchers for company stores, along with terrible work conditions that caused rampant diseases and violence. This was all permitted due to the United Fruit Company's abusive contracting system, where they would contract workers via third-party companies, a loophole that would dissolve them of any legal blame for breaching Colombia's labour laws. When workers expressed their demands to the head of the UFC in Colombia, Thomas Bradshaw, he would simply dismiss them with the excuse that they were not UFC employees, as under this loophole they technically weren't. When they eventually struck, Bradshaw expressed his concern over the situation to Colombian President Miguel Abadia Mendez, who then sent army troops to the region in order to prevent the strikers from blocking the railroad trade route. Just as with the tropical oil company strike incident, the results were fatal. Thousands of strikers were fired upon at once. According to some eyewitness accounts, bodies were allegedly then loaded onto trains before being disposed into the sea. Despite government records minimizing the scale of violence, the incident became infamous around the country after Liberal Congressman Jorge Eliezer Gaitan conducted an investigation into the massacre, concluding and making it public that the Colombian president and the National Army were responsible for the deaths. He was also highly critical towards US companies in the country, stating that they were carriers of death and destruction. Gaitan's outspokenness on such matters would soon transform him into a beloved national figure, particularly among the working class. Eventually, this popularity would lay the foundation for his future presidential campaigns, but more on that later. In 1930, the Liberals came back into power in the country through the newly elected Liberal president Enrique Olaya Herrera. This was achieved largely through the support of feminists across the country who held rallies that inspired women, who did not yet have the right to vote at this point in history, to encourage their husbands to vote for Herrera. To the support of his feminist backers, Herrera made Colombia home to the International Feminine Congress for that year, through which he would pass a reform that would allow women to be the legal owners of any income they earn or money that they already possessed once married. Considering that women had historically been treated as dependents with no financial autonomy, this was a huge breakthrough and laid the groundwork for broader feminist movements in the following decades. Meanwhile, on a financial front, Colombia would find itself matching the pattern of many other countries at the time, experiencing steep economic decline. Amidst the global depression, layoffs and business closures would become commonplace, while a decrease in commodity prices wiped out incomes among rural peasants, leading to a sharp rise in poverty. In an effort to soften the economic blow, President Herrera attempted to convince the US to let them delay repayments of their loans, which, after some hesitation, eventually worked. They'd even receive a new $20 million loan from the US in exchange for a petroleum concession. Still, the economic crisis was undeniable. With such collapse also came an increase in political partisanship. Despite Herrera's attempts to appease conservatives by electing conservative leaders in more than half of the country's departments, tensions between liberals and conservatives still grew dangerously, at least outside of the political elites. Battles were staged out between militias, and in some areas, entire towns were burned down. Local mayors, judges, and even priests, meanwhile, would often be targeted for their affiliation with one party over another. In 1934, aristocrat Alfonso López Pumarejo followed Olaya Herrera as the next liberal president, with Olaya becoming the new foreign minister the following year. Despite his aristocracy, López was rather sympathetic to the working class in his policies and activism. His government became known as La Revolución en Marcha, or the Revolution in Progress, named after one of his speeches in which he highlighted the vitality of constitutional revolution. In general, his government could be described as an expansion of the state's involvement in social and economic reform, transitioning to a more interventionist state that actively sought to address inequalities in these areas. Reforms included the 1936 Law of Land, which allowed unused lands to be redistributed to peasants, along with the comprehensive modernization of public education, which included autonomizing Colombia's national university and consolidating its various facilities into a single Bogotá campus. Notably, his administration also encouraged a secular vision of governance, challenging the church's traditional hold over education and civic life. Whilst controversial among conservative sectors, progressives would hail these reforms as necessary steps towards a modernized society. Despite López's success in passing various reforms, however, things came to a halt when the country experienced an economic slump in 1937, in part due to an increase on direct taxation that López had introduced. Following this, new president Eduardo Santos Montejo, a liberal moderate and owner of one of the country's biggest newspapers, El Tiempo, was elected in 1938. In contrast to López, Montejo had a greater focus on industrialization, which he implemented through the openings of various state-backed factories around the country. This industrial expansion was part of a broader strategy to reduce the economy's dependence on its agricultural exports, such as bananas and coffee, thereby pushing for a vision of greater economic nationalism and increasing employment opportunities in the process. Though still in a foundational phase, these developments would be pivotal in supporting the country's domestic industrial landscape in later decades. As the 1940s rolled around in the following years, so too did the threats of World War II. Overall, Latin America was relatively safe from the war, although fears of Nazi influence were still present. During the time, Germany was increasingly expanding its influence in the region through trade deals, along with instances of espionage from Nazi agents. Despite all of this, Colombia and the rest of Latin America would have a powerful ally in the United States, thanks to the US's Good Neighbor policy, which had been implemented under Franklin Roosevelt back in 1933. This policy promised a non-interventionist approach to foreign relations, meaning that tense affairs with other countries should be solved through civil negotiations such as trade agreements and economic partnerships, rather than harsher approaches such as military intervention. In Latin America, this philosophy would ultimately advance a spirit of collectivist Pan-Americanism, which soon gave way to an increased cultural exchange. In many ways, this policy could be seen as the initial gateway for the surge of interest in Latin American culture throughout the mid-century in the US, along with other Western countries that followed suit. Positive depictions of Latin American culture would soon become prominent across pop culture from Hollywood and US corporations, who brand the region as exotic, yet a cooperative partner in the fight against fascism. The goal of the Good Neighbor policy overall, though, was to improve diplomatic relations, something which would prove useful when the US would later urge neighbouring countries to sever ties with Axis powers and join them in cooperation against the Nazi threat. This was communicated not only on a governmental level, but also via propaganda campaigns spread throughout Latin America. President Eduardo Santos, for one, was sympathetic to the plea. He agreed to cut diplomatic relations with Berlin, acted in ousting Nazi groups, and allowed the US to take security measures within their country wherever necessary. Colombia, meanwhile, would eventually declare war on both Germany and Japan in 1943 after several Colombian schooners were sunken by Nazi forces. Their contribution to the war would primarily involve supplying resources and raw materials such as oil and platinum, and aiding in the protection of the Panama Canal and the Caribbean Sea, often via naval patrol missions. Ultimately, Colombia would make it through relatively unscathed by the war, and even saw some of the highest economic growth on the continent during this time, thanks in part to the hundreds of millions of dollars invested by the US throughout this period, along with a boom in exports, which would experience significant price hikes. A prime example of this was, once again, the US's demand for platinum, of which Colombia was an important supplier. Additionally, many of the country's elite coffee exporters would also experience a surge in profit due to wartime disruptions in other chief coffee-growing countries. The subsequent rise in power among coffee farmers, however, would soon lead to vicious rivalries and corruption. Hostility would grow among farmers over their competing access for land and water, while a widened economic gap between producers and labourers would fuel class tensions. Later, disputes would grow from civilized conflicts into full-fledged acts of intimidation and violence. With many of these clashes occurring in remote rural areas, intervention from law enforcement, meanwhile, would prove to be minimal. In addition to agricultural disputes, broader political tension would also see a surge during this era. As was often the case, the conflict stemmed from the ideological divide between conservatives and liberals. Discord over state centralism versus decentralization, Catholic values versus secularism, industrial interests versus labor rights, and the ongoing dilemma of land inequality would permeate the cultural narrative. Before long, this antipathy would give way to armed skirmishes in rural regions lacking sufficient law enforcement. In some provinces such as Tolima and Boyacá, entire communities loyal to one party or another would stage intense battles against each other. Attempts to defuse the violence by recently elected President Mariano Ospina Perez, meanwhile, were largely inadequate and ineffectual. Ospina's administration was known to take a military-forward approach in controlling dissent, which proved controversial among both liberals and conservative moderates. Their discontent would only be further strengthened by Ospina's favouring of hardline conservative loyalists in key law enforcement positions such as the judiciary and police force. Perhaps most crucially, however, was his refusal to engage in comprehensive dialogue with relevant groups, or to address underlying social and economic issues that fueled the violence. In Ospina's defence, however, maintaining order across the country was undeniably tricky, as political control was often fragmented across smaller local governments, making consistent nationwide policies difficult to implement. Prior Liberal presidential candidate and aforementioned whistleblower Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, meanwhile, would call for non-violent protests against the unrest to take place across the country. One of the most significant of these, known as the March of Silence, took place in Bogotá, where up to 100,000 people marched the streets in silence to denounce the increase of violence. Beyond this, Gaitan also helped raise money to provide accommodation for displaced citizens moving from the countryside into the cities. These efforts would help further cement Gaitan as a champion of the people, especially among the country's lower classes, who for years now had been dealing with deeply rooted issues of land inequality and financial disparity due to a lack of economic opportunities. To these people, Gaitan was a symbol of hope and a voice for the disenfranchised masses due to his apparent willingness to address social inequalities through peaceful political reform. With his charismatic demeanour, comprehensible language, and outspokenness against oligarchy, his popularity would soar into a mass movement known as Gaitanismo, or Gaitanism. This would spread across the nation through both radio and the press, helping to fuel a shared, effervescent sentiment over the current state of affairs. For some traditionalist liberals, however, Gaitan's ability to rouse such influence through grassroots activism was deeply concerning, as it signalled a cultural swing to populist reform over traditional party orthodoxy. Sadly, in spite of Gaitan's efforts, violence across the country would continue to escalate and would soon reach a crucial tipping point. In the early afternoon of April 9, 1948, Gaitan would step out of his office onto 7th Street in Bogotá, only to be shot at by a young man in broad daylight, tragically ending his life. Seen as a last bastion of hope by many, his murder therefore would unsurprisingly be met with massive uproar. This began with a huge, violent riot in Bogotá known as the Bogotazo. The murderer was almost immediately lynched by an angry mob before the scene escalated into widespread violence and chaos throughout the city. Citizens turned against each other, armed with stolen weapons as vehicles were burned, stores were raided, and over 100 buildings in downtown Bogotá alone were firebombed, including government buildings and private businesses alike. In terms of casualties and violence, between 1 and 3,000 were murdered, with many more injured. The army, meanwhile, unable to control the situation, would add to the chaos by carelessly opening fire on civilians, while crime gangs took advantage of the scene to enact heightened atrocities. Some people would even attempt to raid the presidential palace in pursuit of President Ospina Perez before being fired at by government tanks in retaliation. Within a matter of hours, the chaos would also spread to other cities such as Medellin and Barranquilla. Many liberals believe Gaitan's assassination may have been orchestrated by the conservative government as a direct attempt to dampen any future political and social reform. This, of course, radically escalated existing tensions as his supporters sought revenge on conservatives. In reaction, conservatives retaliated, fueling intense violence between groups. Despite some educated guesses, the definitive motive behind Gaitan's murder remains unknown. With political divisions deepened even further as a result of the assassination, however, this was only the beginning of a new era of conflict. Although hostility had been brewing for a while, Gaitan's murder and the Bogotazo in 1948 are widely considered to be the defining events that sparked a decade of widespread and particularly brutal conflict between liberals and conservatives. This conflict led to the deaths of up to 300,000 citizens, along with the displacement of millions trying to escape the violence. With government authority under severe collapse, it also signalled a rapid degeneration of the traditional two-party system into a form of armed tribalism. As one of the most intense periods of conflict in the country's history, this decade became known as La Violencia, or the violence, due, once again, to the utter brutality and scale of violence. After the Bogotazo and the other riots around the country that followed, however, the vast majority of this violence occurred in rural villages with less governance, with most cities being relatively safe from the conflict. Still, the violence in the villages was undeniably brutal. Entire regions would fall under the control of warlords demanding partisan allegiance, who'd then transform rural zones into battlefields. Party loyalty would then be enforced by means of massacres, destroyed homes, and violence, instilling a culture of fear and coercion. With the influx of displaced people moving into the cities at this time, along with several ISI initiatives, certain areas of the economy, meanwhile, would experience rapid growth throughout this era. The industrial sector in particular would see a significant rise, roughly doubling its output between 1950 and 1960. Industries such as transportation, retail, textiles, banking, and the energy sector, meanwhile, would also experience a boom. Unfortunately, such growth didn't have as great an impact on the middle and working class population, with wages remaining stagnant due to an upsurge in inflation. Policies aimed at controlling this inflation, however, helped the country avoid complete economic collapse. In fact, from 1945 to 1953, Colombia saw an annual economic growth rate of 6%. Amidst this growth, urban hubs such as Bogotá and Medellin would see rapid expansion, with neighbourhoods quickly springing up to accommodate the increased labour force. In order to support the growing population, the government would then promote domestic production for important consumer goods such as textiles, processed foods, and shoes. In terms of employment, meanwhile, many would be absorbed by a rise in infrastructure projects aimed at supporting the growing economy. Despite the growing wealth in the cities, however, rural areas, due to the violence, would continue to see a decline, widening the economic divide. Just one example of this was the severely disrupted agricultural production, a result of the amount of people being forced to flee from their farms to seek refuge in the cities. On the flip side, these laws were somewhat offset by the post-World War II commodity boom. Coffee prices, for instance, would surge, reaching record highs by 1954, benefiting Colombia greatly as one of their biggest exports. Sadly, the beneficiaries of this coffee boom were in many cases corrupt business owners who had taken their lucrative position as estate owners by force from those beneath them through violence and extortion. In certain regions, entire coffee-producing zones would be subject to this conflict, with armed groups forcing liberal or independent farmers into displacement in order to redistribute their land to conservative-aligned elites. In order to fight back against these practices, some of Gaitan's popular supporters would attempt to raise militias. In Cali, for instance, this would lead to the rise of pajaros, a group of assassins privately contracted to hunt these militias down under informal government support. Before long, they'd gain a notorious reputation for their brutal executions and public mutilations, granting them infamy among liberal strongholds. Their actions would mark one of the earlier instances of modern paramilitary violence in the country. After a short while, many conservatives would begin to blame communism, a hot topic during the current ongoing Cold War, as the root cause for La Violencia. The fact that such a conflict had emerged during the beginning of the Cold War also caught the attention of the US government, who grew concerned about the influence of communism in the country. To this, they responded by providing the Colombian government with military and economic aid, signalling a pattern of state intervention that would continue well into the future. They would also influence President Ospina to break ties with the Soviet Union and order the arrest of communist leaders in the country. Now, around this time, beginning in 1946, the Liberals and Conservatives had been making a brief attempt to govern in an informal coalition. This attempted cooperation, however, was riddled with mistrust and disunity, causing the coalition to break apart several times during its brief existence. The entire attempt would reach an official halt, however, when, amidst the partisan tension, the Liberals withdrew from the coalition for the final time in 1949, though they'd still hold seats in Congress. Their departure from the coalition, however, caused a shift to more conservative policies, further polarising the country. In September 1949, Liberals and Conservative leaders even drew fire on each other during a Congress meeting shortly before Liberals attempted to impeach President Ospina. They were, however, unsuccessful, as Ospina ended the Congress before they could achieve this and declared a state of siege. By closing Congress, Ospina would be able to bypass regular legislative processes and use emergency powers to rule by decree. Understandably, this drew a lot of criticism from the public, who saw the move as an abuse of constitutional procedure. His declaration of siege, meanwhile, would be used to justify the deployment of military units into areas viewed as liberal strongholds, only furthering partisan conflict. During the next presidential run that same year, Conservative leader Laureano Gomez was elected. With a complete absence of Liberals in the election after their resignation the year prior, Gomez would run completely unopposed. This, of course, would prove hugely controversial, as his win was seen by many as largely illegitimate in the eyes of democracy. Also controversial were his authoritarian views. As a staunch traditionalist, Gomez's administration would mark a shift away from democratic norms and towards a form of greater conservative repression in the years to come. Amidst this decade of conflict, Colombia would send over 4,000 troops to serve alongside the US in the 1951 Korean War. The Colombian government wanted to highlight their firm anti-communist stance to gain favour with the US. La Violencia had caused great damage to the country's reputation, and so the government saw participating in the war as a means of distracting from Colombia's internal conflict and repairing its international perception. As the only Latin American country with troops fighting in the war, it was a hope that Colombia would gain some prestige on the international stage. Perhaps most importantly, however, the government hoped to receive military and economic support from the US during this time of crisis in return for their assistance. Throughout the war, the Batallón Colombia would play important roles in several battles and suffer hundreds of casualties. Ultimately, their participation was very well regarded by their US allies, who viewed Colombia's sacrifices as evidence of their commitment to Western alliances during the Cold War, earning them significant diplomatic capital in Washington. Also, and perhaps most crucially, the US would award Colombia in their efforts with an abundance of military aid. Despite using the war to bolster the nation's reputation, however, President Gomez remained extremely unpopular within the country. As mentioned earlier, he'd taken a largely authoritarian approach to governance, attempting to centralise power wherever possible, and wanted to pass a constitution that would eventually see him gain dictatorial capacity. At one point, he'd even attempt to introduce censorship legislation, allowing the state to shut down media outlets aligned with the opposition. In response to immense criticism, Gomez would try to frame his authoritarianism as a defence of Catholic and national values, an excuse that hardly resonated with the public. Most crucially, however, his repressive policies only deepened the ongoing conflict of La Violencia, granting him disfavour from both liberals and conservatives alike. This widespread dissatisfaction ultimately stirred the ousting of Gomez from his position in a 1953 coup, led by General Commander of Military Forces Gustavo Rojas Pinilla, who would replace his position as president. Rojas's years of presidency could largely be described as a military rule. His government tripled the country's military budget, increased the army by 1/3, and continued to receive much support in the form of war equipment from the US. Still, in spite of these efforts in military intervention, partisan political conflict had become deeply ingrained in the country by this point, making it extremely difficult to undo. Peace talks with conservative and liberal factions, however, which included promises of amnesty towards those who would agree to lay down their arms, did see some success. Homicide rates would decrease from around 22,000 to 1,900 after just over a year of Rojas's presidency. In fact, this first year was received favourably for many other factors as well. In addition to decreasing armed violence, Rojas inaugurated vital infrastructure such as hospitals around the country and even granted women the right to vote, a landmark reform considering the years of pressure from women's rights organisations. Rojas's presidency was far from spotless, however. His efforts in infrastructure modernisation, for example, were largely concentrated in urban regions, leaving impoverished rural areas neglected. His tenure would also see early forms of several guerrilla groups emerge, who drew on Marxist ideologies to justify their violent retaliation as a result of the government's incompetence in addressing issues such as land disputes, regional conflict, and rampant poverty. From the perspective of public opinion, Rojas's peace efforts were also undermined by his inconsistent policies, which often involved exerting military force while simultaneously championing peaceful, non-violent reconciliation. His methods, though somewhat helpful in reducing La Violencia, would become increasingly dictatorial over time, as he would suppress citizens' civil rights and once again react to conflict with an overkill of military force. One notable example of this was a protest at the National University in 1954, which was fired upon by the Batallón Colombia, killing at least 10 students. Understandably, this incident became a hallmark of the regime's intolerance for dissent, thereby furthering a rise in student activism and underground political organising. Meanwhile, just as with prior President Gomez, Rojas would also attempt to censor news media, going as far as to order the shutdown of liberal newspaper El Tiempo. Ultimately, Rojas's authoritarian rule would draw opposition from both regular citizens and many political elites in both liberal and conservative factions. Importantly, the lack of support from those latter groups would weaken his ability to pass crucial reforms, particularly in rural areas where the state had limited presence. In attempts to regain control, Rojas's government would go as far as to manipulate elections and legally threaten opposing civil society groups, but this would only deepen public mistrust for state institutions. Eventually, these abuses would contribute to many turning to community-based movements or even local militias for protection and governance. Whilst Rojas's term should have ended in 1958, support from the US would see him attempt to stay in office until 1962. Both liberal and conservative parties, however, now more than tired of Rojas, would sign a pact stating their opposition to military and dictatorial rule, instead opting for a return to democracy via a bipartisan coalition government. Such pressure against the authoritarian regime would eventually reach a head in 1957 when the National Army organised a coup against Rojas, forcing him into exile. At this point, the military would assume temporary control of the government before a new president, Alberto Lleras Camargo, was elected in 1958. Despite his exile, Rojas would periodically attempt to return to politics in subsequent decades, though generally with minimal success. Thankfully, his departure would mark a definitive end to direct military control over the presidency. I want to talk next a bit about the aforementioned pact signed between liberal and conservative parties in 1957. This agreement was known as El Frente Nacional, or the National Front. Initially voted upon in a public plebiscite with a 95% approval rating, it stated that liberal and conservative parties would rotate their presidencies every 4 years, irrespective of which party had more public support. Signed upon for the next 16 years, the aim was to share equally in political power in an attempt to reduce conflict. In addition to rotating presidencies, the agreement also stated that both parties would receive an equal amount of seats in Congress, once again, regardless of election results, and that legislation could only be passed with a 2/3 majority. This power-sharing dynamic would also extend beyond national government to both local and regional politics. By now, such a strategy was seen by most Colombians as an absolutely worthwhile compromise if it meant a stabilised democracy, especially in the wake of President Rojas's military rule. Ultimately, the National Front would have a largely positive effect on the country, reducing violence and conflict even around election time. With offices divided equally between liberals and conservatives, however, meritocracy in the government would see a radical decline. Instead, governmental appointment would now be largely based on party loyalty. This would give way to a rise in clientelism, a system where, in this context, jobs in the public sector were provided by the government in exchange for loyalty and votes. From here, the country would experience a huge exponential increase in government positions over the following decades. Notably, while still underrepresented, this included a rise in women entering politics, including the first ever woman senator, Esmeralda Arboleda Cadavida, in 1960, a critical step for a broad advocacy of women's rights. Meanwhile, with a huge influx of migrants who'd come to the cities fleeing from rural areas during La Violencia, many women began to adopt new roles in their lives. Women started attending schools and joining the workforce in far greater numbers than before, thanks to an expansion of education opportunities and growing industrial and service sectors. By the mid-1970s, around a quarter of the workforce in cities was made up of women. Legal reforms during the Front period also began to challenge gender inequalities, for instance improving women's economic rights in marriages, equal authority over young children, and their ability to inherit property. With many of these developments a result of increasing urbanisation, however, women in rural areas remain comparatively constrained by a lack of mobility and opportunities. One huge development for women, families, and the population in general was the expansion of the birth control pill during the late 60s. This development was in large part led by a broader effort from US policymakers and global development institutions to encourage population control. Previously outlawed by the Catholic Church, who deemed it a sin, President Lleras would express his support, stating that family planning should be a matter of family choice. Following its introduction, the pill would go on to cause a radical decline in birth rates. By 1995, the average births per woman had halved from what it was in 1955. Beyond political stabilization, the National Front also came with economic modernization, development in infrastructure, and social reform. For starters, in the economic and industrial sector, ISI initiatives, which already existed as mentioned earlier, received even more investment during this time. New developments and policies included an expansion of infrastructure, including a road network extension that would see previously isolated rural communities connected into the national economy. There'd also be an increase of state involvement in mining, steel, and petroleum industries, along with a large inflow of foreign aid to assist growing local industries, such as textiles, manufacturing, and consumer goods. Meanwhile, other reforms sought to expand access to public education. These initiatives were highly effective, with literacy among adults increasing from 63% in 1960 to 85% in 1981, and university enrollments more than doubling over the course of a single decade. Another key initiative of the Front aimed to decrease poverty in rural areas by addressing the historic inequality in land ownership. This was a problem caused by a minority of wealthy landowners who exerted control over many large estates, leaving a large portion of the rural population without private land or forced to work as tenant farmers under poor conditions. To combat this long-standing issue, some legislation known as the Agrarian Reform Law, or Law 135, was passed in 1961. It proposed to redistribute land to small farmers by expropriating property that was being underutilized from large landowners. To oversee this process, an organisation known as the Institute for Agrarian Reform, or INCORA, was established. This organisation would also support around 45,000 working and middle-class farmers by providing them with credits to purchase farm equipment, seeds, and anything else they may need to support their work. Overall, however, the implementation of Law 135 was often slow, weak, and ineffective due to pushback from large landowners. At best, it stimulated agricultural productivity for large companies, but actual land expropriation and distribution to smaller farmers was rare and generally seen as a last resort option. INCORA, meanwhile, despite laying the foundations for agrarian reform efforts in the future, was too limited in resources to be fully effective. For this, and many other reasons, the National Front certainly wasn't a perfect regime. Projected economic growth, for instance, was limited by rampant government spending, a weak credit rating, along with a population with a rapidly growing life expectancy. On top of all this, the country would be burdened by a 10 to 20% annual increase in inflation throughout the 60s and 70s. Another of the Front's main issues, however, was that it virtually guaranteed a duopoly between the two major parties, making it basically impossible for any smaller entity to gain much power. This would soon become a point of controversy among many grassroots factions, including up-and-coming guerrilla insurgencies. Universities, meanwhile, which had historically been an institution for the rich but only recently saw a huge increase in middle-class enrollment, also became a breeding ground for revolution. Marxist teachings caught on among many students who were disillusioned with economic inequalities and the top-down structure of the National Front, which limited smaller voices. Their resistance could also be observed as part of a global trend, with similar activism at the time occurring across Paris, Berkeley, and Mexico City. Before long, these movements would deeply embolden Colombian student activists, which in turn would catch the attention of emerging leftist insurgencies, who'd begin to see these educational institutions as recruiting grounds. Let's talk a bit more about how these insurgencies first emerged though. In response to the rampant inequality, particularly regarding the aforementioned land inequalities that had not been sufficiently addressed, certain leftist factions began to radicalize throughout the 1960s. From here, several guerrilla groups would emerge. These groups would often seize control of rural areas, of which they would govern through violence and lawlessness. They were often, though not always, inspired by Marxist ideologies from the current ongoing Cold War and the Cuban Revolution, aiming to overthrow capitalism in favour of socialism or communism. In many cases, they even received training and weapons from socialist countries such as Cuba. The three largest insurgencies throughout the 60s were the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, the Popular Liberation Army, EPL, and the National Liberation Army, ELN. The ELN, for starters, would be founded in 1964 by a group of radicalized students and intellectuals who drew from not only Marxism, but a sweeping movement of liberation theology, which I'll explain more later. Essentially though, they viewed armed resistance as a moral obligation. The EPL, meanwhile, founded in 1967, were an offshoot of a splinter communist party, the PCC. They were inspired by the Chinese Cultural Revolution, advocating for Maoism as a revolutionary path for Latin America. Finally, there were the FARC, who before their status as a guerrilla insurgency, would start as a group of leftist peasants. Disillusioned by the violence and neglect they'd experienced during La Violencia, they were motivated primarily by agrarian reform, peasant rights, and resistance against government negligence. To serve their cause, they take over a region in the Tolima Mountains known as Marquetalia, the first of many areas where they'd operate under illegal autonomy from national authority. When the Colombian government subsequently launched a military campaign in the region in order to eliminate illegal self-defense groups in 1964, the results were dire. Instead of destroying the peasants, the operation would only further their contempt and radicalization, thereby leading to the formation of their guerrilla insurgency, the FARC. Similar to the ELN, the FARC were also influenced by Marxist philosophy and socialism, but following their origins as rural peasants, were more directly driven by issues of land reform and rural inequality. Prior to this fallout, Colombia returned to the US for military support in order to address a rise in broader guerrilla violence. Appealing to Castro's recent takeover of Cuba, it was hardly a challenge to stress the severity of the communist uprising in the regions of Washington, who go on to support Colombia through military training, intelligence, and equipment. Military support was only one side of the US's strategy for combating communism in Latin America, however. JFK was in favour of what he called a two-track policy. Counterinsurgency made up one of these tracks, but the other was a less direct and more diplomatic approach in the form of an initiative known as the Alliance for Progress. Launched in 1961, the initiative proposed to foster social reform through economic aid in order to reduce poverty and inequality and increase economic growth and education across Latin America. The ultimate motivation, however, was that social reform would help curb the spread of communism in the region. In Colombia alone, the US committed to the initiative by providing the country with hundreds of millions of dollars over a 10-year period. This alliance was greatly championed by President Camargo at the time, who believed that Latin America risked becoming a historical disaster without significant aid. Much to his delight, Colombia would become one of the first recipients of the alliance's funding in the entirety of Latin America. Unfortunately, however, the initiative was largely unsuccessful. Despite initially having a mild impact in certain areas such as literacy and healthcare, it ultimately succumbed to many significant obstacles such as political resistance, corruption, and a mismanagement of fund distribution. One of its key initiatives, land redistribution programs, meanwhile, would be fiercely opposed by elite landowners. These collective shortcomings would eventually lead to the alliance's demise by the 1970s. The alliance certainly was no substitute for militant counterinsurgency, however, and on this front, the US would go all in via another initiative in 1962 known as Plan Lazo. The plan involved further increasing military aid, such as training programs. It was also under Plan Lazo that Colombian forces launched Operation Sovereignty, the very operation that targeted the aforementioned rural peasants in Marquetalia, thereby leading to the formation of the FARC. Another significant measure from the Colombian military, meanwhile, would involve arming and deploying Colombian civilians in their operations. Through community outreach, the military, under US influence, would aim to win the hearts and minds of rural populations so they would feel compelled to join the fight. Initially meant as a temporary strategy, this practice would later become institutionalized in 1968 under President Lleras Restrepo. This was hugely significant, as it would later give way, at least in part, to a rise of paramilitary groups. These groups consisted of both regular citizens affected by the conflict in rural areas, along with representatives of business elites and wealthy landowners who were often the target of extortion and land seizures from guerrilla groups as described earlier. Like the guerrilla groups, however, the paramilitary would also soon become notorious for human rights abuses. They were known to target not only the guerrilla groups themselves, but also activists, students, and rural communities who were suspected of sympathizing with the ideologies of the insurgencies. Among many of their shared tactics was the seizing of control over rural villages, with many citizens being forced into displacement due to the dire consequences if they didn't align themselves with these groups. By the late 1960s, the US's counterinsurgency efforts had become well established for the country. Hundreds of Colombian officers were trained in elite US military bases, such as Fort Gulick in Panama, where they would learn the most effective techniques for assassination, torture, bomb construction, and interrogation. These trainings would often be carried out by CIA operatives and US Army Special Forces, who then utilized these efforts to expand intelligence sharing networks and regional surveillance. This methodology would later find itself implemented in other countries with Cold War conflicts across Latin America too, such as Chile, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Amidst all this, the aforementioned National Front Agreement, which was scheduled to end in 1974, would receive some terms of discontinuation in a 1968 reform. Perhaps most notably, this reform would remove the policy of preset presidential alternation between the two major parties, along with the 50-50 party parity in public office. Despite these significant changes to governmental structure, however, guerrilla resistance would continue for decades to come. Throughout the 1960s, Colombia experienced a huge cultural renaissance with significant developments in music in particular. At the forefront of this revolution was Delia Zapata Oliveira, an adored dance choreographer who played a significant role in promoting Colombia's traditional dance scene. Traditional regional dances across both the Pacific and Caribbean coast would form the foundation of her innovative teaching methods, which would then be published in manuals made available at the many performances she directed, which toured both nationally and internationally. Her legacy has been recognized and upheld to this day via her foundation, the Fundación Instituto Folclórico Colombiano, which continues to promote the country's many folkloric traditions through dance. One of Delia's dancers also developed her own solo career as a musician. Leonor González Mina was known for her wide musical repertoire, spanning many genres such as cumbia, bambuco, and bolero across more than 30 albums. Her seamless stylistic crossover was indicative of a broader movement at the time that could be described as a musical cultural melting pot. Many distinct African, Indigenous, and Spanish musical traditions began to emerge in a number of genres known collectively as tropical music. This included cumbia, vallenato, salsa, and porro. Although not all of these genres were new, or even originated in Colombia, their revitalization during this decade injected new life into them as they saw a surge in popularity throughout the nation. One of the key aspects that gave rise to this tropical music were the local record labels such as Disco Fuentes and Sonolux. These labels were pivotal in spreading Colombian music not just domestically but internationally as well. They were also highly respected for their cutting-edge studio infrastructure, which launched the careers of numerous up-and-coming artists. Such technology included multi-track recording, magnetic tape, and a rudimentary synthesizer known as the Solovox, all of which would have a huge influence on the soundscape of the time. Meanwhile, beyond music, Colombian cinema and television would also experience a modest revival throughout the decade. Social realism and documentary-style features would soon become popular among experimental filmmakers, while an increase in television ownership would see a rise in local telenovelas, along with imported entertainment, signaling a shift to global mass media consumption. Those without TVs, meanwhile, would often find entertainment in radioteatros, essentially radio soap operas. Another cultural evolution throughout the 60s could be found in fashion. Urban youth in particular would begin to take influence from global fashion trends, including bold new clothing choices such as miniskirts, bell-bottoms, and patterned fabrics. Equally prominent were the new hairstyles of the time. Before long, young men would begin to sport longer cuts, while women experimented with bouffants. As far as literature went, easily the most famous work to come out of Colombia this decade, and arguably ever, was Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 1967 novel Cien Años de Soledad, or 100 Years of Solitude. The novel popularized magical realism, a literary genre and artistic style that depicts the everyday ordinary alongside the surreal and miraculous, but notably treats its fantastical elements as normal and routine within the story's world. This genre would be utilized to varying extents by other Colombian novelists as well, such as Manuel Zapata Olivella and Alvaro Cepeda Zamudio. As for Cien Años de Soledad, Marquez's novel would tell a multi-generational story of the Buendia family and the evolution of their fictional town, Macondo. There's a strong focus on the cyclical nature of their existence, with each new generation being drawn by fate to make the same decisions and repeat the same mistakes as their ancestors, even if the situational context may vary. These themes were largely inspired by the real-life rises and falls of humanity in Colombia throughout the ages, capturing this history in the microcosm of a single family and their local community. The novel was met with huge success, pushing Latin American literature in general into the global spotlight, and even netting Marquez a Nobel Prize 15 years later. Today, the book has sold around 30 million copies and has been translated into almost 40 languages. Its popularity and profound narrative have cemented it as one of the most iconic novels in the world over the last century, making the book a significant source of creative influence for many stories since. On a more serious note, Colombia's Catholic Church also experienced a significant evolution throughout the 60s, as influenced by the Second Vatican Council. Pope John XXIII, who'd assumed the position in this decade, called for a revolution in the Church's advocacy of marginalized communities. This firm stance was received loud and clear in Colombia, who would begin to re-evaluate their view of the Bible, now interpreting it from the perspective of the poor, arguing that salvation was not limited to spiritual transformation, but also required an active approach to social, political, and economic liberation from systems of oppression. This movement, which swept the continent, was known as liberation theology. Through this, priests and religious figures soon became far more active in the promotion of social equality, human rights, labour reforms, and support for grassroots political transformation. Although many of these values are grounded in biblical teachings, it would however soon become apparent that liberation theology was causing a severe swing towards liberal radicalization. Some clergy members had even gone as far as to join violent guerrilla movements such as the ELN. Ultimately, this radical liberal transformation of the church would cause it to become a strong target during periods of political unrest, with its vested political influence seen as a threat by those who oppose these ideologies. I'm going to talk next about the history of Colombia's drug trafficking industry. To properly understand it though, we first need to know exactly why it came to be, and the answer to that lies in the history of drug consumption in the United States. See, drug consumption and specifically drug abuse had been an issue in the US for a long time. In the late 1800s, medicinal opium was widely used for medicinal purposes, but a lack of proper regulation via prescriptions gave way to an epidemic of opium addiction. The Civil War only expanded on this issue of drug addiction, with morphine in particular becoming an addiction among many injured soldiers, a phenomenon sometimes referred to as soldier's disease. Then around the turn of the 20th century, cocaine became widely introduced as a medicine, in many cases as a treatment for opium addiction, and a stimulant in many products such as Coca-Cola. As we know though, cocaine carries many addictive properties of its own, which the government soon picked up on. By 1914, therefore, a new tax on producers, sellers, and distributors of the drug caused its availability to become far more restricted, effectively all but criminalising it outside of medicinal use. This law, known as the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, would be one of the nation's first forays into restrictive drug policy, paving the way for a broader moral panic about drug use. Sensationalist newspapers, for instance, would often exaggerate the link between narcotic use and violent crime, in many cases drawing racial connections as well. Later, many other drugs were popularised, such as heroin, amphetamines, and marijuana, all of which eventually received their own restrictions such as prohibitive taxes that limited their distribution. During the 1960s and 70s, the US saw another huge rise in drug use, now becoming one of the world's largest drug consumers, if not the largest. This was in part due to a rising countercultural movement that embraced recreational drug use as a symbol of rebellion and personal freedom. In 1971, the Nixon administration officially declared a war on drugs, citing it as public enemy number one. A couple of years later, he established the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration. This administration was a consolidation of several earlier drug enforcement and intelligence agencies, such as the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs and the Office of Drug Abuse Law Enforcement. With this amalgamation came stronger authority aimed at enforcing drug laws on a global scale. Although the Nixon administration's anti-drug initiatives were universally applicable, many historians argue that the real target of this drug war was marginalised communities. For many years, drugs had received a racially charged connotation to certain communities, such as marijuana with Mexican immigrants, cocaine with African American communities in the South, and opium with Chinese immigrants. As such, drug patrolling became particularly prominent in these communities, in spite of the questionable validity behind these cultural associations. Although the claims of these communities being the largest consumers of drugs were largely inaccurate and driven by racist stereotypes, it was true, however, that large quantities of drugs in the US were being supplied by other countries. By the late 1960s, Mexico was the US's largest supplier of marijuana, and by the 1970s, their largest supplier of heroin. To combat this, the US government launched many anti-drug campaigns that would target Mexican marijuana production and smuggling. One of these was known as Operation Intercept, which instigated compulsory drug searches for all road, foot, and air traffic crossing the Mexico border. The clampdown on Mexico, however, would only cause drug producers to relocate their operations to other countries, such as Colombia. Colombia had several advantages as a drug producer and distributor. For starters, it was bordered by two oceans and contained huge frontiers of fertile land. Much of this land lacked any proper governance or state presence, making it relatively easy for farmers to cultivate their crops in secret. For many of these farmers, cannabis cultivation was also incentivized as a lucrative alternative to underperforming legal crops at the time. Despite Colombia's brief success in the marijuana trade, however, demand for weed would soon fall by the late 70s when many from the US began to cultivate cannabis on their own soil. Rather than exiting the drug trade altogether though, Colombian traffickers would merely diversify. Though the marijuana trade had shrunken, traffickers would very soon find a new lucrative opportunity in smuggling cocaine, another drug that had recently skyrocketed in popularity in the US. With much of the infrastructure for drug smuggling in place already, this transition was extremely rapid. At the time, Bolivia and Peru were the two leading countries for coca production, so Colombia would instead become a processing hub. Here, producers would establish cocaine labs known as kitchens, where coca paste could easily be processed into high-purity powder in a matter of days, allowing for rapid dispatchment. The kitchens were far from the only infrastructure employed by traffickers though. To break the smuggler's journey, for instance, an airstrip spanning almost a kilometre along with a yacht harbour would be constructed on an island in the Bahamas. Its geographic location would allow for strategic stopovers for pilots before they flew on to Florida not far north. Though many participated in the trade, the most famous of these trafficking operations was run by a man you may know as Pablo Escobar. Previously a small-time car thief, Escobar would get his start in the business by setting up coca labs in Antioquia and the Magdalena River Valley. These operations proved wildly successful, and before long would attract the attention of many investors looking for stakes in the business. Beyond his success, the investors were also attracted to a key strategy Escobar employed: risk insurance. This was something he'd sell to smugglers, allowing for compensation in the case that drugs were lost or seized by authorities. By the late 1970s, narcotics imports from Colombia were a well-established issue, and the US government was more determined than ever to act. In 1977, therefore, newly elected President Jimmy Carter sent psychiatrist and director of the White House's Office of Drug Abuse Policy, Peter Bourne, to confront Colombian President Alfonso López on the issue. He carried with him a stern letter from Carter addressed to López, which came attached with a document from Bourne known as the Bourne Memorandum. The document stressed the severity of the situation, highlighting the inadequacy of Colombia and the US's efforts in combating narcotic trafficking and the needs for both countries to improve their cooperation against it. Most notably, however, it contained a list of all known public officials in Colombia suspected to be in the pay of narco traffickers. After meeting with Lopez, Bourne perceived that the Colombian president firmly understood the severity of the issue and was more than willing to improve their cooperation. Therefore, he reported back to the White House that a breakthrough could be expected, prompting Carter to report to Congress a month later that the issue was a high priority for Lopez. The reality, however, turned out to be the complete opposite. Lopez outright refused to take action against anyone on the list, including his two accused ministers. In an attempt to shake things up, someone likely from the Carter administration would later leak the Bourne memorandum to the crew of CBS's 60 Minutes, who would then relay some of the list on their show. Aired in 1978, this segment would cause stark outrage in both the US and Colombia, though for very different reasons. In the US, viewers were astounded by the alleged extent of drug corruption. In Colombia, however, viewers were outraged by what they perceived to be a public shaming campaign. For many, it felt as though the US was villainizing their country without taking responsibility for the significant role their cocaine demand played. Later that year, one of the men listed on the Bourne memorandum, Julio Cesar Tobay Ayala, would become the new president of Colombia. In an attempt to distract from his ties to drug traffickers, Tobay took stern action against the trade. One of his first initiatives was to organize the spreading of a toxic herbicide across cannabis farms in northern Colombia. This would prove highly controversial, as the herbicide would also sometimes contaminate nearby rural water sources and food crops, causing grave health implications. Beyond this, military troops would also conduct routine searches across drug cultivation regions and arrest suspected farmers. Sadly, these campaigns would also cause unjust damage to local communities. Due to a lack of reliable intelligence, raids would often include mass arrests, with little investigation into the actual actions of each individual. From an enforcement perspective, these searches also largely failed to put a dent in the drug trade. Though many of the arrested were certainly complicit in cultivation, few had direct involvement in processing, trafficking, or any other cartel operations. In spite of this, raids would continue to be carried out on a grand scale. Looking beyond the drug trade, emerging guerrilla activity throughout the 70s would also prove to be a nation-leading issue. Besides the existing FARC, ELN, and EPL insurgencies, another large guerrilla group known as the 19th of April Movement, or M19, would form around 1974. The catalyst for their formation was the supposedly mysterious defeat of their preferred presidential candidate, the aforementioned General Gustavo Rojas Pinilla, in the 1970 presidential election. Many activists believe that Rojas' defeat was an act of electoral fraud, considering that he appeared to be winning the popular vote late into the night of election day. 4 years later, these activists, consisting of disillusioned breakaway liberals along with communists and radicalized students, would retaliate by taking up arms and mobilizing into M19, named after the date of the 1970 election. Ideologically, the group championed democratic populism, embracing symbols of anti-corruption and sovereignty, often inspired by Simón Bolívar. In fact, one of their first acts as a group was to steal Bolívar's sword from a museum, using it as a symbolic emblem of his supposed unfinished struggle. To combat M19, along with other insurgents, President Torbay would launch a new security initiative in 1978 known as the Estatuto de Seguridad, or the Security Statute. The main purpose of the statute was to enlist the military to enforce public order wherever necessary. Notably, it also allowed the military to try any civilian suspected of drug trade links in secret. Such leeway was arguably abused, with arrests not limited to criminals or even suspected criminals, but rather anyone suspected of radical leftist ideologies. Before long, arbitrary raids and detentions would be carried out en masse across the country, especially in rural and marginalised communities. By 1979, an estimated 60,000 civilians were being held in custody, many of whom were reportedly tortured. Understandably, the security statute would therefore draw deep condemnation from international human rights organisations. By the late 1980s, Colombia's illegal drug trade was worth roughly 5% of the country's GDP, estimated between $2 to $4 billion per annum, far outweighing revenue for many other large exports, including coffee. Narco-traffickers at the top of the food chain would use this wealth to fund lavish lifestyles, while buying out entire shopping centres, soccer clubs, hotels, and large companies to use as fronts for the trade, along with a significant percentage of the country's farmlands. To distract from their operations and garner positive public reception, meanwhile, some traffickers would also finance vital infrastructure in impoverished areas, such as schools and health clinics, thereby winning the loyalty of many among the lower class. In the countryside, however, it was a different story. Here, narco-traffickers would often enlist paramilitary groups to kill anyone who posed a risk or inconvenience to their operations, such as peasant farmers, rival dealers, and certain guerrilla factions. Both massacres and violent land sieges would soon become commonplace in these areas, ushering in a new era of rural terror. Whilst the trade was undoubtedly lucrative for some within it, the effect it had on the rest of the country was a very different story. Although the surge of foreign currency led to a significant appreciation of the Colombian peso, any inference of a stronger economy was pure illusion. On the contrary, GDP per capita outside of illegal industries would plummet by 36% between 1981 and 91. By this point, the market had become truly distorted, as legitimate businesses just couldn't compete with enterprises backed by swaths of laundered money. Meanwhile, the injection of narco dollars into the economy was causing huge inflation, especially in real estate prices in large cities such as Medellin and Bogota. Speculative real estate bubbles would soon give way to overdevelopment in wealthier areas, while poorer neighborhoods saw few such initiatives, giving way to a sharp rise in the nation's already pervasive wealth disparity. To make matters worse, these injustices would be harder than ever to deal with, as the trade had also infiltrated political institutions, law enforcement, and judiciary, compromising the process for legal reform. Understandably, such corruption would deeply undermine public trust in Colombia's democratic institutions and dampen hope for justice. So now we know a little history about Colombia's drug trade on a broad level, I thought it would be important to discuss the most infamous drug lord of the country, Pablo Escobar. I described his beginning in the industry a bit earlier, but as the epicenter of chaos in Colombia throughout the 80s and early 90s, we have a lot more to talk about here. Although most Colombians see Escobar as a despicable crime lord who caused nothing but pain, there was actually a small portion of society who viewed him differently. See, during the late 70s and early 80s, Escobar became known as somewhat of a Robin Hood figure among the poorer neighborhoods of his home city, Medellin. Here, he was known to use part of his wealth to fund philanthropic efforts within needy communities, such as housing construction, soccer fields, health clinics, and other public infrastructure initiatives. Perhaps his most well-known of these projects was the Barrio Pablo Escobar, a revitalized neighborhood that would rehouse hundreds of squatters in permanent brick homes. Despite passionate acclaim among those he'd helped, there were however some ulterior motives behind Escobar's initiatives. By gaining deep respect and trust from a loyal base of supporters, Escobar was essentially building a network of people who'd be more than willing to serve him and defend him from law enforcement. Additionally, this outcry of public support would eventually help bolster his efforts in joining politics, something that would further help cleanse his image, expand his influence, and perhaps most importantly, grant him immunity from extradition to the US. Luckily for Escobar, he would eventually gain affiliation with the Colombian Liberal Party through regional connections before running for a seat in Colombian Congress as an alternative for Congressman Jairo Ortega. This political entrance would signal a dramatic inflection in the rise of narco power. It wasn't long, however, before Escobar's political aspirations faced scrutiny from several journalists and politicians. Notably, Justice Minister and staunch supporter of US extradition, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, publicly denounced him as a criminal after uncovering evidence linking him to the drug trade. Meanwhile, Luis Carlos Galán, leader of a faction within the Liberal Party known as New Liberalism, would pressure party leadership to sever ties with Escobar. The last straw for Escobar, however, was the decision to lift his parliamentary immunity from extradition, though technically extradition law still hadn't been implemented. Regardless, Escobar did not take kindly to this decision, and after leaving the party in 1983, he set out to have his biggest critic, Lara Bonilla, murdered. A local assassination squad would pick up the contract worth over $500,000 US, and in April 1984, two gunmen would shoot down Bonilla as they passed his car on their motorcycle. For both the government and Colombian public alike, this event would be viewed as a watershed moment in narco conflict, demonstrating the true scale of Escobar's empire. In response to this tragic incident, Parliament would soon fight back by fully implementing its extradition treaty into law. This, however, would infuriate cartel leaders, fearful that they may be targeted. In retaliation to the reform, they would then enact a vicious killing spree, murdering 32 judges and magistrates in just over a month. This emerging tactic, which became known as narco-terrorism, would soon become a widely used coercion strategy, in this case an attempt to force the justice system to reconsider its extradition laws. The Supreme Court, however, would not back down in their extradition threats. In response to this apparent refusal, Escobar, allegedly, would orchestrate a pivotal act of terrorism that would send shockwaves around the nation. Though the act itself was carried out by guerrilla group M19, some speculate that Escobar was the real mastermind behind the scenes, merely using M19 to do his bidding. Whatever the case, M19 certainly had motives of their own, following a recent fallout with the government. Despite currently being in a democratic dialogue with Parliament, they'd recently found themselves under attack from paramilitary death squads who, notably, were using Colombian army intelligence. This, of course, was taken by M19 as a severe betrayal. Escobar, however, would allegedly use their grudge to his advantage and in 1985 was speculated to have paid the group $1 million to storm the Palace of Justice, thereby putting President Betancourt on trial for his alleged knowledge of the assassination attempts against them, which violated their peace agreement. Amidst this, they would also demand an end to extradition, as per Escobar's alleged request, and the release of imprisoned guerrilla members. 35 N-19 troops would carry out the operation, seizing the building with over 300 hostages. To this, Betancourt would call the Colombian army to deal with the situation, however this would soon prove fatal. Although they succeeded in ridding the palace of M19, they did so through extreme measures, shooting at the building for hours and even employing tanks to blast the interior. This destruction would see the deaths of 100 people in the building, a significant portion of whom were civilians, along with roughly half of the Supreme Court justices. The palace would also catch fire, leading to the burning of around 6,000 case files. Among these, incidentally, was the file concerning Escobar's US extradition. As a matter of fact, the extradition treaty in general would also be suspended the following year in 1986 under what was deemed constitutional grounds. After the palace was retaken the day after the incident, the Colombian army, for reasons unknown, would arrest 11 people, 10 of whom were service staff for the palace, before killing them, a gross human rights violation. Some reports allege that these killings were based on a suspicion that some of the staff may have been involved in the operation in some way. There is, however, no credible evidence to support their cooperation. In the following years, this incident, along with the palace siege more broadly, would receive an official investigation from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, who sharply criticised the government for their excessive use of force and insufficient communication in the aftermath. Before long, the incident would become known among the Colombian public as the Holocaust of the Palace of Justice. Ultimately, the severity of such a security lapse, the lack of government transparency about the incident, and the failure to recover some missing hostage bodies would also fuel many long-standing suspicions of state infiltration by drug money. Beyond state resentment, however, the palace siege would also intensify existing rivalries between armed groups, rebel or otherwise. The Colombian military, for instance, would become increasingly hostile towards any kind of peace discussions with insurgent groups, and suspiciously sympathetic towards paramilitary, with whom they arguably had some shared interest. M19, meanwhile, would only become a bigger target for these paramilitary groups, with 350 of their roughly 2,000 members being killed in the first few months of 1986. Unlike much of the guerrilla conflict from earlier years though, these killings weren't confined to country regions. Many kidnappings and political assassinations would now occur in major cities such as Bogotá, Medellín and Cali. Amidst the unrest, a new president, Virgilio Barco Vargas, was elected in August of 1986. Barco would make it his duty to continue peace talks with rebel groups, and even managed to get M19 to demobilize and surrender their weapons. This would mark one of the few successful peace agreements of the era, and would give way to the reintegration of hundreds of fighters into civilian life. With the drug cartels, however, Barco took a harsher stance, reinstating extradition by executive order. In retaliation to this, the Medellín cartel would once again go on a killing spree, threatening journalists, judges, and prosecutors who supported the order to change their stance or face certain death. Pushed into a corner, Barco decided that the best way forward was to try and negotiate with Escobar to stop the violence. Escobar would not bend to the government's terms, however, and would continue demanding for the abolition of the extradition treaty, tax amnesty, and judicial pardon. Now, one of the most high-profile advocates for extradition around this time was the aforementioned Liberal Party member Luis Carlos Galán. As it happened, Galán posed a significant threat to the cartels, as he was highly likely to win the upcoming presidential election in 1990. The Medellín cartel, however, would take no reservations in dealing with the situation. In August 1989, therefore, as Galán attended a public rally in the main plaza of the Soacha district in Bogotá, 18 assassins would hide among the crowd, ready to draw fire. As Galán began his speech, he would be shot upon multiple times before being rushed to hospital, where he would sadly succumb to the injuries. It was later discovered that some of Galán's bodyguards had colluded with his assassins. Unsurprisingly, the assassination caused stark outrage across the country. As one of Colombia's most prominent reformist leaders at the time, Galán was, similar to Gaitán several decades earlier, considered by many a symbol of hope. His death, therefore, would only increase public resentment over the nation's struggle against narco-trafficking and political corruption. President Barco, for one, would respond by intensifying military operations and deploying elite police units who would go on to arrest thousands of suspects under cartel payroll. This, however, only led to an escalation of cartel violence, which included bombings and attacks on public infrastructure. Many public spaces would transform into battlefields, especially in Medellín, while police assassinations would be carried out in the hundreds. Amidst all this, the Liberal Party was now gearing a replacement candidate, an economist from Pereira named César Gaviria Trujillo. Like Galán, Trujillo held staunch support for extradition, perhaps now even more so following Galán's assassination. History would almost repeat itself, however, with Escobar likely attempting yet another public assassination, this time even deadlier than before. On November 27, 1989, believing Trujillo to be on a commercial flight to Cali, Escobar reportedly organised for the plane to be bombed. This brutal act of terrorism would tragically kill all 107 passengers aboard the plane, along with 3 people on the ground below in Bogotá. Among the victims were Colombian business people, families, and even children. The incident would mark one of the most devastating acts of aviation terrorism in all of the Americas up until this point. Trujillo, however, by complete coincidence, had luckily decided to skip the flight at the last minute, ultimately sparing his life. He'd therefore go on to be elected as the president in 1990. The incident, meanwhile, would also catch the attention of the US, after they discovered that 2 of the deceased passengers were US citizens. For the White House, this was the last straw. Soon after, President Bush would approve a US military operation to hunt down Escobar. To help achieve this, a special US intelligence agency named Centrospike would be deployed in Bogotá. Here, they would intercept phone calls and radio signals in order to help track the location of their targets. On the Colombian end, meanwhile, a recently established military force known as the Bloque de Búsqueda, or Search Block, was also tasked with hunting down Escobar with Centrospike's assistance. This partnership between nations would mark a new phase in US counter-narcotic initiatives, one where broad drug policy would be supplemented by boots-on-the-ground offensive and intelligence sharing. Some Colombians, however, would begin to question the ethos of Washington's growing influence in their internal affairs. By the early 90s, the Colombian government was more desperate than ever to curb the violence caused by the Medellin cartel. Under relentless pursuit, Escobar decided to surrender voluntarily under some key conditions. Namely, these included stipulations that he would not be extradited to the US, that he would be able to design the prison where he'd serve his sentence, and that Colombian authorities such as police were not allowed anywhere near the prison's premises. To much public criticism, the government agreed. In 1991, extradition for Colombian citizens was abolished under a new constitution which I'll discuss later, and Escobar had his own prison constructed to his liking near his hometown of Envigado. Nicknamed La Catedral, or the Cathedral, the so-called prison was more akin to a luxury estate, fitted with lavish decor, a bar and disco room, a jacuzzi, a soccer field, and incredible views of Medellin. It was also far from solitary for Escobar, who'd invite hundreds of guests to share in his opulent lifestyle. Most crucially, however, Escobar was able to continue the operations of his cartel while incarcerated, easily managing to orchestrate violence and murders via orders to his lackeys who'd visit him. Some of these murders even took place on site of La Catedral, namely a couple of the cartel's top lieutenants, Fernando Galeano and Gerardo Moncada, who were killed based on Escobar's suspicions of cartel fund embezzlement. News of these murders would soon spread among cartel factions, sparking tension particularly among those loyal to Moncada and Galeano. Disillusioned with Escobar's hold on the cartel, these members would soon break away from his leadership entirely, before sharing vital intelligence from the organization with both law enforcement and Escobar's rivals. More broadly, news of these murders would also make waves both nationally and internationally, exposing the true extent of Escobar's freedom. Under public pressure, the Colombian government finally decided in 1992 to forcefully transfer Escobar to a traditional prison. As they closed in on La Catedral to arrest him, however, they discovered that Escobar had escaped on foot. Amidst national disillusionment over the government's apparent inability to capture Escobar, a vigilante assassin group would emerge, intent on taking matters into their own hands. The group was known as Los Pepes, short for People Persecuted by Pablo Escobar, and consisted of paramilitary groups, former Medellin cartel members, and disgruntled landowners who'd been negatively impacted by the cartel's violence and corruption. Behind the operation, the Cali cartel also offered logistical support and financial aid in the form of $50 million to eliminate Escobar, who was obviously their biggest rival. As a means of weakening Escobar's support network, Los Pepes would then go on a murder spree, assassinating many of his suppliers, family members, accountants, lawyers, couriers, and drivers. What made these killings even more significant, however, was that they were orchestrated using intelligence from the Colombian Search Block, along with Centrospike, the aforementioned US agency tasked with tracking Escobar. For this latter agency, however, it has not been publicly confirmed whether information was provided deliberately or via indirect leaks. Whatever the case, Escobar's opponents would use the intelligence to make quick work in destroying his empire over just a few short months. As his associates were killed, his smuggling routes disrupted, his resources diminished, and hideouts infiltrated, Escobar would soon experience a dramatic fall from power. Throughout his descent, Escobar's focus would largely shift to his family, who were in a rising danger of being killed as coercion. As a last-ditch solution, he'd therefore spend his final days trying to secure safe passage for them to leave Colombia. Unsuccessful in his efforts, the Colombian government would soon step in to offer the family protective custody. This, however, was a tactical move. Authorities believed that by holding custody of the family, they would have leverage against Escobar, reducing his options for negotiation. They would also use it as an intelligence-gathering opportunity. Escobar would constantly make calls to his family, making him vulnerable to surveillance. In fact, it was this exact strategy that would ultimately lead to his demise. On December 2nd, 1993, a phone call between Escobar and his son was intercepted by Centrospike before being relayed to Search Block. The phone call allowed the force to pinpoint his location to a residential Medellin neighborhood. It was here that a search block agent spotted Escobar peering out of the second-floor window of a safe house. As police assembled and stormed the hideout, Escobar would try to flee via the rooftops with one of his bodyguards. As gunfire broke out, Escobar would be unceremoniously shot to death. The police would then join together in a famous photo with his corpse, representing an end to one of history's most relentless manhunts. Officially, it was claimed that Escobar was killed by police snipers, although some speculate that Escobar may have shot himself under a personal credo that he'd never be taken alive. Whatever the case, Escobar's death would be a landmark moment in the war on drugs, both within Colombia and globally. As we've just discussed, Escobar's involvement in the drug trade had a tragic impact on many aspects of life in Colombia. Perhaps one of the less expected ripple effects though was his indirect impact on the native biota, due to some animal species he introduced that later escaped captivity. Now before going on, I do want to shout out a fellow foreigner I met in Colombia a little while ago for bringing this tidbit to my attention. I believe her name was Maggie. If you're watching, hi. But yeah, basically what happened was that during the late 70s and early 80s, Escobar imported a number of exotic animals from Africa and the US for a private zoo on his Hacienda Nápoles estate. Among these animals were a few hippos, which some websites claim were chosen to help hide cocaine supplies from authorities. According to certain sources, their droppings would actually fool sniffer dogs searching for drug shipments. Whatever the case, their ecological impact would prove to be highly disruptive. While many of the other animals would eventually be sold and relocated after Escobar's death, the hippos were not easily movable and therefore remained at the hacienda. With the estate largely abandoned, however, its enclosures would soon deteriorate, allowing the hippos to roam freely. By the mid-2000s, the hippos would even manage to escape the site altogether before moving into rivers and lakes across the region. With a lack of natural predators to contend with, the hippos were also able to reproduce rapidly. The initial 4 or so hippos would quadruple to around 16 during this period. Over the last couple of decades or so, this rapid reproduction has only continued, with recent estimates claiming between 181 to 215 hippos in the Colombian wild as of 2023. At such numbers, these hippos have become an invasive species in Colombia, threatening native ecosystems and local fauna. Due to their large biomass and substantial food intake, for instance, a single hippo can produce around 6 kilograms of waste per day, which significantly alters the water chemistry of the lakes and rivers they inhabit. This is further exacerbated by their tendency to graze on land before entering the water, thereby introducing organic terrestrial content into aquatic systems that are not evolved to handle such a matter. Under such conditions, the livelihoods of local fish and other aquatic inhabitants have been severely disrupted. Many of these species have seen a sharp population decline, thereby damaging ecosystems that depend on their ecological function. Outside of the water, the hippos also commonly cause riverbank erosion. When entering and leaving the water, they'll often trample vegetation with root systems vital to soil stabilization. Once again, this affects many animals relying on the stability of these banks and their vegetation, including turtles, manatees, otters, and capybaras. In response to this predicament, the Colombian government has announced several preventative strategies aimed to curb further growth of the hippo population. These strategies include surgical sterilization, relocation, and as a last resort measure, euthanasia. The Ministry of Environment even issued a regulation for controlled hunting, though this is yet to occur. Unfortunately, counter-efforts have generally proven logistically complex and oftentimes costly. Relocation attempts have faced many legal hurdles and coordination issues, while euthanasia and hunting of course remain somewhat of a politically sensitive strategy. Still, without intervention, hippo population numbers are projected to reach the thousands within a decade. The actions the government chooses to take now, therefore, will play a vital role in determining the future of many Colombian ecosystems. Whilst Escobar's indirect environmental footprint was a bizarre side effect of his aftermath that few imagined, the real elephant in the room following his death was, of course, the question of the Colombian drug trade and its future. So what exactly happened in the wake of such a kingpin being wiped from the board? Well, with Escobar gone, the Medellin cartel would almost immediately collapse, allowing the government to seize control of their many smuggling routes. It was under this sudden power vacuum, however, that the rival Cali cartel would soon step up to become the nation's new dominant force in drug smuggling. Often seen as the more corporate cartel, the Cali cartel's operations tended to fly further under the radar compared to the explosive publicity their Medellin counterpart was infamous for. Namely, the Cali cartel was more heavily reliant on front companies in order to launder money and hide their illicit business. When it came to smuggling, they'd even sneak cocaine into legal shipping containers so as to avoid suspicion. Despite their comparatively more discreet operation, however, they would be dismantled by the government only a few years later, more on that in a bit. Beyond the Cali cartel, many leftist guerrilla groups, already involved in drug trafficking since the 80s, would also take advantage of the trade's decentralization to assert far greater control of the business for themselves, in turn helping to fund their operations. This included the earlier mentioned FARC insurgency, who, through drug trafficking and extorting landowners, had grown much wealthier and more affluent since their inception in the 60s. As a direct reaction to this rising power, however, paramilitaries also saw explosive growth throughout this period. These paramilitaries were often comprised of, or represented, wealthy landowners, business elites, and drug traffickers who the FARC had negatively impacted. Importantly, these paramilitaries were obviously private and operated outside of government jurisdiction. The government, however, would have a hand in legally sanctioning the formation of other civilian groups around this time. Sadly, whilst initially legal, these groups, known as convivires, would often go on to become fronts for paramilitary death squads by the late 90s due to weak government regulation. Their crimes, however, would soon be brought to light by the emergence of a number of reports from human rights organisations who'd link convivire groups to a number of massacres. Many of these convivires too would also see themselves joining the drug trade to fund their operations. With both guerrillas and paramilitaries now firmly cemented in this industry, disputes over farming territory would then give cause for a new wave of violence between groups. Drug-related corruption, however, was also to be found in places far higher up the food chain. 1994's Liberal President-elect Ernesto Samper Pizarro, for instance, was accused of having connections to the Cali cartel, having allegedly received a $3.75 million donation from them. Before long, this scandal, dubbed Proceso 8000 or Process 8000, would become one of the biggest political controversies in Colombian history, leading to mass resignations and arrests while severely tarnishing the state in the eyes of the Colombian public. The US, meanwhile, would choose to temporarily suspend much of its foreign aid to the country in light of the predicament, and even revoke Pizarro's US visa. Amidst this whirlwind, Pizarro would attempt to enact damage control by taking a firm stance against the Cali cartel, going as far as to hunt down and arrest its leaders, the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers, the following year in 1995. Despite this achievement, however, Samper Pizarro's presidency was left ultimately tarnished and crippled by the ongoing cloud of suspicion caused by the allegations against him. Beyond the Colombian government, meanwhile, drug ties would also soon come to light up further north. Just a few years after the Proceso 8000 scandal in Colombia, a former US Department of Justice Director of International Affairs, Michael Abel, would be charged and indicted for his own ties to the Cali cartel. Two federal prosecutors, Donald Ferguson and Joel Rosenthal, were also indicted under similar charges. This, of course, severely undermined the credibility of the US in their anti-drug initiatives and only further exposed the depth of the cartel's influence. Even before these connections came to surface, however, the 1994 US midterm election would see a growing number of Republicans become increasingly outspoken against the rising chaos of the drug war. Under this sentiment, the government would undertake several new counter-narcotic initiatives. One such effort would involve training Colombia's first ever anti-narcotics battalion in late 1999. On a more controversial note, the US would also financially back Colombia in fumigating many coca and poppy plantations. This practice would involve dropping toxic herbicide from planes over farms in a number of southern departments. Due to the high altitude of the sprays, however, the chemicals would often drift into legal crops in the area, along with livestock, pastures, and water sources. This understandably caused much contention among farmers, many of whom had grown sick from the contamination. With a lack of clean water or viable farmland, displacements would also surge under these fumigations. In response, a number of environmental groups would rise up, demanding for greater oversight along with protection of legal agriculture. In 1996, a protest march of around 150,000 peasant farmers would even take place against the program in the city of Puerto Aziz, revealing the true scale of rural discontentment. Despite the large turnout, however, the government would be slow in enacting reform, leaving many country folk in deeper distrust with the state. Following decades of national strife, including civil conflict, narco-violence, political corruption, and the assassinations of multiple presidential candidates, the beginning of the 1990s would bring about an effort in broad political transformation. These winds of change would first emerge in early 1990, when several Colombian students would run a campaign known as Séptima Papeleta, or Seventh Ballot, advocating for a reformation of the constitution. The campaign, whilst unofficial, gained widespread traction among the general populace before soon being embraced by President Gaviria. At the end of that same year, a national election was held to select some representatives for a constitutional assembly, the group who would write the now greenlit constitution. Notably, among the candidates for the assembly was the former guerrilla group M19, who'd now legalised into formal politics. Even more interesting, however, were the election results. When the polls were over, it was announced that M19 had won more votes than any other party. Following this news, the former insurgency would decide to join in a coalition with another party known as the National Salvation Movement, a right-wing group known for a strong anti-communist stance. Though certainly unexpected, the coalition, however, was less to do with ideological alignment and more to do with a shared stance on certain pragmatic issues. For instance, both groups opposed the traditional dominance of the larger liberal and conservative parties that came about through the National Front. Ultimately, this coalition would help steer the constitution in a major new direction. Namely, the assembly would end up going far beyond the originally planned revision, instead opting to rewrite the constitution entirely. Consisting of 380 articles, this new constitution would go to great lengths in strengthening democracy and political decentralization, reorganizing judicial systems, along with recognizing many fundamental human, economic, and social rights. Regarding decentralization, some key reforms included the establishment of specific elections for local government, such as mayors and governors, along with an explicit constitutional right for people to form new political parties, something which technically wasn't outlawed before but also wasn't explicitly permitted, leading to the imposition of many restrictions. In terms of social rights, the Constitution officially declared Colombia a social rule of law state, emphasizing the importance of a legal framework based on freedom and equality that everyone, including the government, was subject to, while also requiring the state to reach beyond the law to ensure the well-being of its citizens and promote social justice wherever needed. A couple of notable initiatives here included granting Afro-Colombians their own national electoral district, along with giving varying levels of self-determination to indigenous groups, allowing for self-governance according to their own indigenous customs and traditions, along with land rights. Meanwhile, besides defining healthcare, education, and social security as fundamental rights, the Constitution also introduced the tutela system, a legal mechanism that would allow for the protection of these rights. Under this system, citizens could file a complaint if they believe their rights had been breached, which would then be reviewed by a judge who could issue orders to offenders. This system would go on to be one of the most popular legal tools in the country, with up to hundreds of thousands of cases filed each year. For marginalised communities in particular, having a system in place to demand state action in key areas such as healthcare access and environmental protection would be a major breakthrough. In the instances of certain high case offences, cases could also be reviewed by an independent judicial system, the newly created Constitutional Court, established to oversee constitutional issues. Beyond the justice system, the new constitution would also significantly transform the nation's economic infrastructure. Perhaps most notably, Colombia's central bank would now have control over inflation and be able to regulate monetary policy. This newfound independence was an important factor in ensuring stable economic growth for the country in the following decades. As a social rule of law state, there was also greater emphasis now on balancing free market principles with social justice, leading to market regulation that would protect consumers, workers, and the environment. Another important amendment, meanwhile, included the formal separation of church and state, for the first time since 1876. In practice, however, the Catholic Church would continue to maintain certain unofficial privileges, such as its prominence on the education curriculum of schools throughout the country, and even some official recognition such as the public observation of Catholic holidays. Overall, whilst the 1991 Constitution was largely received positively, it wasn't entirely without controversy. Some felt, for instance, that it didn't go far enough to fully separate church and state in practice, despite the official separation on paper. At the time, some also worried that the rights for self-governance granted to indigenous groups would weaken national unity and cause legal loopholes. Perhaps the most controversial provision, however, was the blanket ban on extradition, as mentioned earlier. In 1991, Pablo Escobar was still at large, and many believe that this ban was a direct concession to his demands. Thankfully, the ban would eventually be overturned in 1997, although many would argue that it should have been sooner, considering Escobar had died a whole 4 years prior. Ultimately, the constitution would also often be undermined by weak state institutions, particularly in rural areas caught in the crossfire of criminal violence and power. Still, shortcomings aside, this political charter would go down as one of the most ambitious and positive democratic reforms in the history of Latin America. In 1997, US Senator Patrick Leahy would make some amendments to the US's Foreign Assistance Act, with the intention of altering the conditions on which the US provided military aid to other countries. Essentially, these amendments would prohibit US military aid to any foreign security forces who'd been determined to have committed human rights violations, something which had historically been an issue in many countries. As one might expect based on the human rights issues outlined in this video, this would have a drastic effect on Colombia's US-backed military operations. The Colombian military's ties to paramilitary groups over the years would soon be brought to light, requiring many human rights audits to help the US keep track of these abuses. A strict vetting process would be established, disabling military and police units from receiving aid until verified as clean. In some cases, the military would try to cover up their crimes, but the stringency of the process would account for this and blocked aid until there was definitive verification of compliance. With the US being such a key component in the country's military funding, the Colombian government would have no choice but to support the endeavour. This would ultimately lead to the creation of many human rights officers within Colombia's armed forces, along with the rise in prominence of human rights groups across the country who would create databases to document abuses. Later, this would be followed by a surge in transitional justice mechanisms throughout the major cities in the mid to late 2000s. These systems would be instrumental in empowering many previously ignored victims of displacement, disappearances, and extrajudicial killings. Despite stricter requirements for military aid, however, funding from the US would only increase in the years following the Ley amendments. Alarmed by Colombia's continuously growing drug trade and the power of its beneficiaries, who'd seized control from the state over many rural areas, it was clear that strong action needed to be taken. In 1998, the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, even went as far as to predict that the Colombian army would be completely toppled by drug-backed insurgencies within 5 years, should a drastic military restructuring not occur. Thus, the following year, a task force known as XCOM was created, aimed at countering narcotics and organised crime across Latin America by providing intelligence and emergency recommendations. The formation of this agency would be part of a broader US security strategy that viewed Latin America as a potential security threat following the Cold War. Colombia specifically was seen as the epicenter of this threat, given their status as the region's largest cocaine producer, along with their powerful guerrilla insurgencies. The US believed that if these groups weren't contained, Colombia could become a narco-state, where vast criminal networks could operate with international influence. On July 13th the following year, President Clinton and then Colombian President Pastrana would form Plan Colombia, an initiative aimed at countering drug production and armed conflict. Pastrana would commit $4 billion to the plan, while foreign countries such as the US and the European Union would collectively provide $3.5 billion. For the US, the vast majority of this funding was in military support, aimed at combating guerrilla insurgencies such as the FARC, who played a large part in fueling the trade. This aid included intelligence, equipment, and special operations training, much of which was operated and maintained by US contractors. Beyond the war on drugs, military aid was also seen largely as a means of protecting the US's huge mining and energy investments in the country from guerrilla attacks and sabotage, something which had become a notable issue. To supposedly maximize the efficacy of this support, President Clinton was also granted by the House Senate Conference Committee the ability to waive human rights conditions introduced in the aforementioned Ley Amendment whenever he saw fit. He would then go on to exercise this authority almost immediately after the State Department informed the White House just a month later that the Colombian military was in full violation of the amendment's criteria. Several international human rights organizations would also warn of the Colombian army's complicity in civilian massacres and paramilitary activity, but Clinton would justify the waiver, citing the urgency of counterinsurgency and narcotics control. By 2002, the US's determination to deal with the FARC in Colombia had only expanded. According to US corporations based in Colombia, such as those in the energy sector, guerrilla attacks on their infrastructure had only persisted, an issue that the now George Bush administration was more open than ever to combat with military force. More notably, however, were the events of 9/11 the year prior, definitively hearkening in the US's war on terror. Under this context, the US would begin to reclassify violent insurgencies through the lens of global terrorism, thereby justifying heightened military action. As it happened, it was also around this time that Colombia was dealing with a spike in terrorism at the hands of the FARC. The insurgency was upset that the government had recently retaken a large military free zone that had previously been granted to them as part of a peace dialogue. In retaliation, they went on a violent rampage, blowing up public infrastructure such as pipelines and electrical grids, along with kidnapping certain political leaders. These acts would even prompt hundreds of mayors across the country to leave their local offices and govern remotely for their own safety. Perhaps the most egregious offence, however, was in May 2002, when the FARC launched a cylinder bomb into a church during a battle with paramilitaries in Choco, reportedly claiming the lives of up to 119 villagers who were taking shelter. In another incident during February of the following year, meanwhile, they would plant around 200 kilos of explosives in the underground parking lot of an athletic club in North Bogota, which would tear through 10 floors of the building, killing 36 people. Understandably, this was met with significant public outcry, motivating thousands of Bogota residents to take to the streets in protest the following day. From here, societal sentiment would shift even further against the guerrillas. Beyond the regular business elite opposition, both the middle class, along with civil society movements, would also become more outspoken in their discontentment. This onset of guerrilla destruction, paired with the insurgency's involvement in drug trafficking, would even prompt the Bush administration to characterize the FARC as the most dangerous terrorist group in the Western Hemisphere. Amidst the unrest, a new Colombian president, Álvaro Uribe, would be elected in August 2002. Given the government's failed peace talks with the FARC, the Colombian public wanted a leader who was ready to take a firmer stance against the insurgency, and Uribe was seen by many as fitting the bill. Interestingly, Uribe was alleged to have some ties to paramilitaries, but in a desperate fight against the FARC, these allegations were not enough to sway the public against him. For the FARC, however, it was a different story. When Uribe was elected, they would immediately act by launching mortars at his inauguration ceremony, killing a reported 12 to 19 people. Uribe, not one to back down, would soon devise a plan which would include an expansion of state presence and military force in guerrilla-controlled rural areas, aimed to weaken the FARC along with the ELN, the other main guerrilla insurgency. Allegations, however, would soon arise that many paramilitary groups had also been functioning as unofficial enforcers of Uribe's military strategy. Among these groups was the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, or AUC, a recently formed coalition of paramilitaries from across the country. Previously, paramilitaries had typically only operated as independent groups, or bloques, so the formation of a large body such as the AUC was particularly significant, as it allowed them to exert far greater influence. Their growing power meant that, despite pushing out both the FARC and ELN from many urban areas, and reducing their overall territorial control, objectives were not achieved without many human rights violations and massacres, as paramilitaries would often extend their attack beyond the immediate target. Many a time, rural citizens even suspected of sympathising with guerrilla groups would become victims of torture, disappearances, and even massacres at the hands of the paramilitary. Additionally, displacement would also reach record highs during this period. By the mid-2000s, over 3 million Colombians would be forced to evacuate their homes, some of the highest rates of displacement in the world at the time. As the controversy surrounding the paramilitaries mounted, Uribe would eventually attempt to counter their growing influence with a 2005 amendment titled the Ley de Justicia y Paz, or the Justice and Peace Law. The law aimed to demobilise and extract confessions from paramilitary groups such as the AUC in exchange for softer punishments such as reduced prison sentences. To some extent, it was a success. Tens of thousands of paramilitaries demobilised over the following years, including some of the top AUC leaders. Much to the government's dismay, however, many would include in their confessions details regarding government and national military links to their operations, including high-ranking generals. This would soon lead to the parapolitics scandal, where in addition to the military, around 1/3 of the country's senators and Congress were revealed to have been in the pay of paramilitaries. Unfortunately, despite mass resignations, many however would evade justice through a variety of means, including political interference and plea bargains. Investigative journalists and prosecutors, meanwhile, would often be physically threatened when pursuing vital leads. Such political impunity would only reinforce public cynicism towards the government, with many now doubting their sincerity in reconciliation efforts. As for the thousands of now demobilised paramilitaries, many would simply go on to operate under new criminal groups, often called BACRIM, short for Bandas Criminales or criminal bands, where they continue in acts of extortion and assassination, along with drug trafficking operations. A few years later, in May 2008, the Colombian government would abruptly decide to extradite 14 of the top paramilitary leaders to the United States. This operation was discreetly carried out overnight with no public announcement until the plane had already departed to the US. President Uribe's official reason for the extradition was that the leaders had failed to comply with the aforementioned law of justice and peace. The alleged reason, however, was, at least in some part, to silence further testimonies regarding government and military ties to the paramilitaries following the parapolitics scandal. Most bewildering was the fact that, once in the US, the commanders were not tried for their war crimes at all, but rather only their involvement in drug trafficking. This would ultimately lead to shorter sentences, which, along with the following decline in testimonies back in Colombia, would leave many paramilitary victims without true justice. With the rise of the aforementioned bandas criminales, meanwhile, the power vacuum left by the extradited commanders would soon be filled. On the whole, Plan Colombia did help in reducing guerrilla terrorism to an extent. Part of this included Uribe's overhaul of security. Significant expansion would be seen in both the military and national police force, the latter of which doubled in size. To this, homicides would soon see a decrease of around 40% and kidnappings of around 80% between 2002 and 2006. Such results would also help motivate a marked increase in foreign investment. Meanwhile, in the years following, the FARC, with the help of some real-time US intelligence, would be the subject of several leadership decapitation initiatives, removing top commanders such as Tomas Medina Caracas, Gustavo Rueda Diaz, and Raul Reyes. The operation targeting Reyes via a 2008 military bombing was particularly controversial due to the fact that it occurred on the Ecuador border. Ultimately, this apparent violation of Ecuador's sovereignty would cause a diplomatic fallout with Ecuador, along with several neighbouring countries. Despite taking years to restore relations, however, Colombian operatives viewed the initiative as a vital success in their attempts to fracture the FARC's command structure. Speaking of high-profile operations, 2008 would also see the success of a highly coordinated and widely publicised hostage rescue mission. Known as Operation Jaque, the initiative would see the rescue of 15 hostages from FARC captors. Among the victims were Colombian police and military personnel, American defense contractors, along with former presidential candidate Ingrid Betancourt. The mission would become particularly famous for its non-violent strategic approach that saw operatives trick the FARC into thinking that they were members of a humanitarian organisation come to transfer hostages to another camp. Of course, in reality, such an organisation wouldn't willingly choose to aid a rebel insurgency, but through some clever deception, the operatives would nonetheless earn the FARC's trust. From here, the FARC would allow its hostages to board a helicopter, which, unbeknownst to them, was operated by the Colombian military, merely disguised as human rights workers. Ultimately, the success of this operation would mark a major turning point in public perception of the government's fight against guerrilla groups. Uribe, for one, would see his approval ratings soar. This acclaim would ultimately net him a second presidential term, something which was only possible with a constitutional amendment. For a number of Colombians, however, the non-violent approach of Operation Jaque was merely viewed as an exception to the norm. The effects of Uribe's more militant warfare strategies elsewhere, meanwhile, would persist as a serious concern, particularly for the displacements they commonly caused. Rural populations would often find themselves in the crossfire of Colombian military, guerrillas, and emerging criminal gangs, leaving them with no reasonable choice but to evacuate. Entire communities would then be forced to move into city outskirts in poor conditions with minimal state support. Displacements, however, were far from the Colombian military's only emerging controversy. Another notable atrocity was the infamous false positive scandal, where it was revealed that the military had killed thousands of innocent civilians, framing them as guerrillas in order to inflate body counts for job promotions. Many of the victims were found to be young men, often lured from poor neighbourhoods with the promise of work, only to be executed before being dressed in guerrilla uniforms. In addition to these tragic crimes, there's also strong evidence to suggest that the Colombian military knowingly turned a blind eye to paramilitary support, who, as discussed, would often instigate extrajudicial killings and even massacres. Understandably, such abominations deeply undermine public trust in the state. The broader militant approach in general, however, would also prove controversial for many, who'd cite concern for the government's apparent refusal in addressing underlying causes such as poverty, weak institutions, and inequality. In spite of these numerous and severe shortcomings, Plan Colombia once again did manage to at least curb guerrilla violence. The same, however, could not be said for the initiative's other main target, the drug trade. On this front, efforts would prove largely ineffectual. Although drug cartels had certainly been weakened and in many cases dismantled, many fragmented networks such as the aforementioned bandas criminales would simply step in to take their place. The FARC, ELN, along with paramilitary groups would also become more involved in drug trafficking to finance their operations. Ultimately, with traffickers finding new ways to evade authorities, the global cocaine supply would not see a meaningful decrease, despite billions spent on these anti-trafficking initiatives. In response to production crackdowns, criminal organizations would also begin to diversify increasingly into other illicit economies, such as arms smuggling, illegal gold mining, and human trafficking. For all of these failures, along with the previously described human rights abuses and warfare scandals, the US and Colombia would eventually decide to adjust the focus of Plan Colombia. From 2008, military funding was scaled back and aid began to shift towards other initiatives such as judicial reform, institutional reform, and human rights protections. Key zones across the country collectively received hundreds of millions of dollars in funding in new consolidation initiatives. These projects were aimed primarily to rethink the US's military forward strategies in counterinsurgency to provide longer-lasting solutions. The initiatives largely revolved around establishing a greater state presence in key earmarked areas. This was achieved through building vital infrastructure such as roads, schools, and health centres, along with police stations and other government institutions. These developments were part of a framework known as El Centro de Coordinación de Acción Integral, or the Comprehensive Action Coordination Center, a concerted effort in military pacification and socio-economic outreach where a strategy of clear, hold, and build had become a central credo. The idea was that through providing public services and economic opportunities to civilians, the appeal of armed groups and coca cultivation would decrease. As such, it was seen of great importance to engage local communities before initiating operations so as to involve them in the transformation. In practice, however, many of these communities felt that they were often excluded from planning and that Colombian military presence never fully subsided, leading to a continued distrust of the state. Regardless, the initiatives were viewed by the US as a revered model for diplomatically reasserting control over areas of unrest, particularly in its pilot zone of La Macarena, which up until that point had been a FARC stronghold. These consolidation plans, however, were not the only attempts to reform the peace-building process. Just a few years later, then-President Juan Manuel Santos would take a radical new approach in addressing FARC conflict. Namely, Santos would initiate a series of meetings with the FARC beginning in 2011 in order to explore peace negotiations. What made this particularly significant was that Santos had served previously as a defense minister under Uribe, rendering his transition to such a diplomatic approach highly unexpected for many. Ultimately, though, Santos framed these peace talks not as an act of surrender, but as a necessary strategic solution to decades of conflict. Of course, such a transition would not be instant. Despite a subsequent killing of FARC leader Alfonso Cano at the hands of the government later that same year, though, the insurgency was surprisingly cooperative in initiating negotiations. Both parties would soon meet together in Oslo in Norway, and later Havana in Cuba, who'd agreed to be guarantors to their discussions. These discussions would be structured in key stages, beginning with exploratory dialogues before advancing to more actionable strategy. Ultimately, the meetings would prove to be highly fruitful. By February 2012, just 1 year in, the FARC would announce a complete cessation of all extortive kidnappings before signing a formal peace negotiation roadmap in August 2012. This roadmap dictated several important contentions and considerations that needed to be addressed, including discussions of land reform, official political participation of rebels, a formal ceasefire, and resolve to drug cultivation, the latter of which the government addressed by decriminalising marijuana and cocaine possession in 2012, an attempt to undermine the black market by challenging drug policy orthodoxy. Despite the new peaceful direction, however, President Santos wasn't quite ready to abandon military intervention altogether. In fact, in 2012, just a year after the preliminary phases of the peace talks had begun, he would launch a brand new military campaign known as Espada de Honor, or the Sword of Honor. The goal of the campaign was to deliver strategic blows to high-value targets within the FARC and other guerrilla factions, along with the bandas criminales. The catalyst for the operation was a discovery from government intelligence that over 90% of overlap between political and criminal violence could be tracked to as little as 10 locations or less across the country. For this reason, the initiative would be comparatively smaller than previous military strategies, yet arguably more effective. Where previous operations made broad sweeps across large areas, Espada de Honor would contain itself into these key centralised zones where insurgent activity was most concentrated. These zones were generally in rural areas of the country with minimal state presence, including certain parts of Meta, Cauca, and Catatumbo. For many years, they'd been used as arms and drugs corridors, along with recruitment centres, but that would all soon change. After just a few years, the Espada de Honor operation would see unequivocal success in achieving its goals. Within the FARC alone, over 10,000 members were either captured, demobilised, or killed, including dozens of its leaders between 2012 and 2016. For the bandas criminales, meanwhile, similar results could be observed, with their forces seeing a reduction of over 4,000 within the same period. Ultimately, the results of Espada de Honor would grant the government a great deal of leverage over the FARC in peace discussions, eventually leading to an important peace deal in 2016, but more on that later. Besides Espada de Honor, Santos would also launch several other restorative initiatives throughout his presidency. Efforts were expanded to help demobilise combatants from the guerrilla and paramilitary reintegrate into society, aiding them in attaining education, job training, and psychological support in their rehabilitation. Community reconciliation programs were also hosted in partnership with civil society organisations in order to reduce public stigma surrounding former fighters. Further reducing the public impact of insurgencies, meanwhile, was the Territorial Consolidation Plan, which aimed to increase state presence in rural areas cleared of guerrilla control. This involved bringing government services such as schools, roads, health clinics, and police stations to these areas, along with funding crop substitution programs for those growing illegal or harmful crops such as coca and cannabis. The latter of these measures, however, was sadly undercut by frequent delays in support, along with poor market access, prompting many farmers to return to illicit agriculture. Another significant initiative for abandoned land was the 2011 Victims and Land Restitution Law. The goal of this law was to redistribute land to, and financially compensate, the millions of Colombians who'd been dispossessed of their property due to civil unrest over the years. This was a tall order, as the land collectively amounted to an estimated 16 million hectares, or 14% of the entire country. To make matters even trickier, ownership records for much of this land were often non-existent or falsified. Unsurprisingly, therefore, results came incredibly slowly. 5 years later, only 2% of the almost 100,000 claims had been adjudicated by the Land Restitution Unit. This would only be further complicated by the fact that much of the land in question had since been transformed into agro-industrial projects or palm oil plantations. Claimants, meanwhile, would often face intimidation or violence from armed groups and wealthy landowners, deterring many from completing the process. Finally, beyond land reform, another key initiative Santos launched was the formal investigation into extrajudicial killings that had occurred at the hands of the Colombian army over the last decade or so. Over the following years, thousands of members would be subject to investigation, with hundreds of these receiving convictions. Ultimately, Santos and his push for restorative policies would prove popular enough among the public to grant him a second presidential term in 2014. Arguably, however, his win may have been more influenced by a public scandal involving the rival candidate, Oscar Ivan Zuluaga, who'd been alleged to have used military hacking software in order to expose the peace negotiations in Havana, a scandal that would become known as the Andromeda Affair. Whatever the case, Santos' win would soon give way to one of his most important accomplishments yet. Following many years of peace talks with the FARC, the negotiations would finally reach a victorious conclusion, a long sought-after peace deal. Signed in September of 2016 between Santos and the FARC, the peace accord was designed to end decades of FARC violence once and for all. The conditions of the deal outlined that the FARC would disband, lay down their arms under UN supervision, surrender the land they'd laid claim to, and reintegrate into civilian life. In exchange, they would receive support for education, employment, and housing, and would be allowed to form a legal political party with guaranteed seats in Congress until 2026. Those who confessed to war crimes, meanwhile, would be offered reduced sentences as a sweetener for cooperating with investigations. Just as important to the accord, however, were the promises it outlined for FARC victims. Reparations were promised to include monetary compensation where possible, restitution of land for displaced people, rehabilitation services, along with memorial efforts such as monuments and broader cultural recognition. Additionally, as part of an attempt to address rural inequality, largely seen as one of the root causes for armed conflict, the agreement promised to distribute 3 million hectares of mostly state-owned land to poor rural families, whether impacted by the FARC or not. On top of this, farmers with informal ownership of land would be promised ownership in a legal title, aiming to formalise around 7 million hectares of farmland. Of course, this all sounded great in concept, however the deal actually required the opinion of another party before it could be ratified, the General Public of Colombia. To gather a consensus, a public plebiscite was held across the nation, asking a simple question: do you support the final accord to end the conflict and build a stable and lasting peace? Around 13 million of the eligible 35 million would then go to cast their vote, a relatively small turnout for such an important issue. Perhaps more surprising, however, were the results of the referendum. Tallied up, the percentage of affirmative voters would amount to 49.8%, while those against the deal would consist of an extremely tight 50.2% majority. In spite of this, both Santos and the FARC were determined to push the deal through. A popular concern for the no voters surrounded the supposed lack of true justice, with the repercussions for the FARC being viewed by many as too light on. To address this, the peace accord would receive a revision containing several amendments that would crack down harder on the FARC in certain key areas. These included harsher penalties for those who committed war crimes, exclusion of amnesty for some of the most serious crimes, stricter criteria for political participation, tighter deadlines for members to confess their crimes, greater penalties for those unwilling to confess, and several other additions. With these revisions, the accord would then finally find its approval in Congress during November 2016, where it would be passed without a second referendum. At long last, after 50 years of their operation, the FARC would officially cease to exist as a unified armed group. By mid-2017, around 7,000 members would demobilise, with roughly 8,000 weapons being laid down by the insurgency, marking a historic victory for the nation. They'd then form a formal political party, first known simply as FARC, before renaming to Comunes in 2021. In terms of judicial hearings, many FARC leaders would offer formal confessions to crimes such as kidnappings, forced recruitment of minors, and murder. A Truth Commission, meanwhile, would also collect many accounts from FARC victims before releasing its final report publicly in 2022, providing at least some justice for the many affected. Sadly, however, these victories would not mark the end of political violence more broadly. After the FARC withdrew from their strongholds, other rebels would simply move in to fill the vacuum. These included paramilitary successor groups, criminal gangs such as the Bandas Criminales, FARC dissidents who'd rejected the peace deal, along with the ELN, the other main guerrilla group. Coca-growing zones and drug trafficking corridors, meanwhile, would soon be reclaimed, with cultivation even reaching relative highs around 2017 and 18. As a result, the nation would soon see a surge in rural armed conflict due to territorial disputes. Beyond group rivalries, these rebels would also enact a spree of systematic assassinations, targeting hundreds of activists who opposed them in order to silence dissent. Since 2016, the death toll of social leader assassinations has exceeded 1,000, although they're not the only group to have been targeted. Over 400 former FARC fighters have also been killed in the same time period, likely by FARC dissidents, drug traffickers, and paramilitary successors who either maintain past resentments or are disgruntled by the supposed treachery of demobilization. Additionally, many ex-combatants and social leaders have also been targeted for their advocacy of land restitution and rural reform, which often challenge the interests of elite estate owners and corrupt politicians. Speaking of land, the peace deal's proposed land reform propositions to redistribute and formalise land for relevant communities have also stalled significantly. As of mid-2025, about 3.2 million hectares of land has been formalised, less than half of the proposed 7 million hectares. As for land redistribution, the government has achieved only 200,000 hectares, merely 7% of the proposed 3 million. In many cases, these poor results have been caused by budget restrictions and other bureaucratic hurdles, leading to great discontentment towards the government among affected communities. Ultimately, the peace accord was far from perfect. It has, however, undergone significant evolution since its inception in 2016, for better and for worse. 2018 elected President Ivan Duque, for instance, would enact several revisions that would crack down harder on the FARC and rebel groups in general, with Duque arguing that the accord was too lenient on the insurgencies and therefore unjust for victims. Some of his actions included an attempt to block FARC members from holding political office until they compensated victims, and a shift from voluntary coca crop substitution to forced eradication, sometimes involving the military. His administration, however, was also weak in reintegrating former FARC fighters into society, with proposed support in housing, education, and employment often being underfunded. Additionally, security guarantees and programs for the demobilized fighters and targeted social activists would often be inconsistent in implementation, leading to the assassinations of hundreds as described earlier. Then of course there were the aforementioned delays in land redistribution and formalization operations. All in all, many of these factors would weigh heavily on the public come election time again in 2022. Much of the rural population especially felt that Duque had undercut the peace deal through underfunding. It was under this political climate that the nation therefore made a bold swing, electing what many describe as Colombia's first left-wing president, Gustavo Petro. Although the country had obviously had its share of liberal governments throughout history, Petro stood out for being the first president from outside the traditional two-party establishment since its inception. Stemming from his own grassroots movement, it was the hope of many that Petro would revitalise the country in a way that the traditional conservative and liberal parties could not. Another significant allure was his total peace policy. Under this initiative, Petro proposed to engage not only rebel insurgencies, but all armed groups in the country in restorative peace dialogues. Beyond guerrillas and paramilitary, this would also include drug trafficking cartels, criminal networks, urban gangs, and more. In addition to negotiation and dialogue, the policy also aimed to reduce violence from its roots through several social investment initiatives. These included investments in infrastructure, education, and employment in affected rural areas, with the goal of making armed conflict less appealing. In terms of land reform, meanwhile, Petro proposed to fully implement the land redistribution and formalization programs that had stalled under Duque. Ultimately, the total peace policy was posited as a course correction to Duque's apparent misdirection, offering a demilitarized diplomatic approach to peace, along with a more proactive approach to restoration. Despite the policy's considerable support, however, Petro's acclaim was far from universal. From early into his campaign, many would raise concern about his shady past. Namely, throughout the 1980s, Petro was a member of the guerrilla insurgency M19, working as a propagandist and community organiser. In 1985, he'd even been arrested and imprisoned for illegal arms possession, though he claims he never used weapons during his involvement. Regardless of this controversial history, Petro would nonetheless emerge as victor in the 2022 election by a slim majority vote of 50.4%. Ultimately, his tenure has seen mixed results. As of late 2025, Petro's approval rating stands between 34 and 44%, a somewhat apprehensive figure that can be attributed to a number of political failures, including many of his total peace initiatives. Several armed groups, for instance, have exploited Petro's peaceful ceasefire agreements, using the lack of military presence to consolidate power and expand territorial control. As a likely result, these groups have risen by around 45% since Petro's election, reaching around 22,000 members. Under this rise, several regions have experienced increased conflict between armed factions, thereby leading to an onset of displacements. In response to these failures, many security analysts have criticised the total peace policy, suggesting that it's inadvertently strengthened armed rebellions on the whole. So that's a bit about Colombia's state of security up until present day in 2026, and with that we are almost nearing the end of this video. There was, however, another important aspect of Colombia's history that I wanted to cover before finishing up, and that is the subject of US trade. See, throughout the 90s, back before free trade with the US existed, many multinational companies from Colombia and several other Latin American countries had benefited from a tariff reduction agreement from the US known as the Andean Trade Preferences Act. This was granted on the condition that these countries implement certain counter-narcotics objectives to assist the US in their anti-drug initiatives. Later, in 2002, the ATPA would evolve into the Andean Trade Promotion and Drug Eradication Act, which granted free trade for a number of products. This was particularly significant given that, as of 1995, the US already accounted for around a third of Colombia's international output. Over the decade following the implementation of the ADPDEA, therefore, the nation's economy would soar. Oil, finance, and infrastructure in particular were powerhouse industries for foreign companies in the country, seeing a huge boom within the mid-2000s. Then again, this could also be attributed to other factors such as rising global commodity prices and internal security reforms. Critics, meanwhile, would argue that this model of export-led growth, whilst greatly beneficial for large firms, did little to reduce income inequality, particularly in underdeveloped regional areas. Agricultural exports from rural communities, for instance, such as coffee, flowers, and bananas, continued to face stiff competition from subsidized foreign producers. Even still, broader foreign direct investment figures were not to be sniffed at. By the 2010s, the country was receiving up to $10 billion and more in FDI annually, a huge leap from decades prior. Unsurprisingly, this was largely aided by the further easing of trade restrictions. Specifically, throughout the 90s and early 2000s, the US had wanted to expand NAFTA, its existing multilateral free trade agreement with Mexico and Canada, to the majority of Latin America. Unsuccessful in achieving this due to resistance from many of the proposed countries, they would at least manage to sign a bilateral free trade agreement with Colombia known as the US-Colombia Trade Promotion Agreement. From the US's perspective, the agreement aimed to expand their access into Colombia by eliminating tariffs for most goods and services, along with tightening foreign investment protections. Despite being signed in 2006, it wasn't until late 2011, however, that the deal was finally ratified. During this 6-year gap, many Democrats in Congress, along with labor and human rights organizations, would oppose the agreement, citing concerns about Colombia over labor rights, violence against unionists, and paramilitary influence in the government. The deal's eventual approval and implementation, therefore, was mostly thanks to an initiative aimed to directly tackle some of these concerns, albeit mostly focused on labor reform. Known as the Labor Action Plan, the initiative put forth by the Obama administration was essentially a list of labor commitments that the US required Colombia to fulfill before agreeing to the FTA. Among these included requirements for organised labour protections, the investigation and prosecution of anti-union related violence, along with general reforms in labour laws and conditions in key sectors such as mining and agriculture. It also required the government to improve their labour inspection system and provide protection for union organisers. Whether or not Colombia achieved these reforms is another discussion entirely, but their proposed commitment at least was enough to grant the FTA's approval in Congress before it would go into full effect in early 2012. In terms of the effect of free trade between the US and Colombia, results have been mixed. Commodities such as flour and coffee would experience a notable boost over the years. The nation's largest exports, however, would continue to come from mining sectors such as oil, coal, and gold. Throughout the 2010s, these combined industries have contributed to around 40 to 70% of annual export revenue. Due to this lack of diversity, though, the country has historically been vulnerable to global price shocks, as seen during the oil crashes in 2008 and 2014. Similar factors also caused a roughly 50% dip on the value of the Colombian peso between 2014 and 2017. Be that as it may, the country has arguably fared worse in terms of free trade imports. The arrival of competition from heavily subsidized US agribusiness, for instance, has undercut many small farmers, sometimes pushing them into coca production or even displacement. Overall, the results have been devastating to the livelihoods of many in rural areas, though interestingly, poverty has reduced somewhat in the cities. This stark wealth gap has easily become one of the nation's leading issues. In 2016, for instance, Colombia's rate of income inequality was among the worst globally. So that would have been all I'd have to say about Colombia and the US's recent trade history, but as I'm sure you know, there have also been some very recent developments in the form of President Trump's Liberation Day trade tariffs. Now, although this particular order was pushed globally back in April 2025, the recent timeline for Colombia actually goes back a few months earlier. Essentially, back in January, Colombia was in some hot water with Trump due to a controversy surrounding deportations. Specifically, amidst an onset of mass repatriations, President Petro was refusing some US deportation flights containing Colombian immigrants to land in their country. In order to counter this, Trump would threaten to inflict a 25% tariff on all imports from Colombia before escalating to 50% within a week if Colombia didn't agree to cooperate with his deportation plans. Beyond tariffs, Trump would also threaten to impose visa bans for all Colombian nationals wishing to travel to the US for any reason. Pushed into a corner, Colombia would ultimately cooperate with Trump's demands, albeit on their own terms. Namely, Petro would not allow the US military to carry out the deportation. Instead, Colombia would send its own planes to pick up the deportees from US facilities as a means of preserving national dignity and sovereignty. Of course, the story doesn't end there though, as on April 2nd, Trump would announce his Liberation Day tariffs on countries around the world. For Colombia, this would be a 10% baseline tariff on most exports to the US. As you may know, Trump described these tariffs as reciprocal, meaning that the US was supposedly trying to mirror the tariffs that other countries imposed on their imports from the US. For example, if Colombia charges 10% on American-made cars, the US could choose to retaliate by charging 10% on a Colombian import, such as flowers or coffee, at least in theory. In practice, however, strict reciprocity was rarely observed. In the context of Colombia, for instance, these tariffs would not be applied proportionally in equality to Colombia's US import taxes, but instead would be applied almost universally across most Colombian exports. Adding to this that the US is the nation's biggest trade partner, and it was no surprise that the tariffs were met with stern criticism in Colombia for their potential consequences on the economy. Luckily for Colombia, the order would, however, receive legal pushback in the US. On May 28th, the US Court of International Trade would rule that the tariff implementation was unconstitutional and exceeded Trump's emergency powers. They'd then issue a permanent injunction meant to bring the tariffs to a definitive halt. In response to this, though, the US Department of Justice would file an emergency appeal on the ruling, arguing that Trump's actions were indeed legal. With this appeal issued, it was then up to a higher court known as the Federal Circuit to decide whether to uphold or overturn the initial ruling. By the end of August, this court would ultimately affirm the CIT's assessment that the tariff implementation was unconstitutional. Following these results, however, the Department of Justice would make an appeal to an even higher court, the Supreme Court, for a truly definitive hearing. This hearing would occur on November 5th, though at the time of recording, the justices are yet to reach a consensus. Until that happens, the tariffs will remain active. This, of course, may carry some serious consequences for Colombia's chief US exports. Flour exports in particular would likely experience the greatest impact. Given the nation's status as the second largest flour exporter in the world, and the fact that 80% of these exports go to the US, a flour market crash could cause severe disruption, leading to many job losses in rural Colombia. Similar effects, meanwhile, may also be felt in other low-margin exports, such as fresh produce and textiles. Even Colombian coffee, which has historically performed well against global competition, could see reduced profit margins as US roasters search for cheaper contracts. On a broader economic level, these declines could leave a large impact on the nation, potentially weakening the national trade balance and the value of the Colombian peso. Rural areas reliant on exports, meanwhile, would likely experience an onset of job losses and employment setbacks. Ultimately, a lot is on the line for Colombia, and so the decision of the US High Court will hold great significance for the nation's future. Alright, so that's about all I have to say about Colombia and the US's recent trade history. Of course, depending on when you're watching this, there may be some further developments, but as of recording, that's really about it for now. Before I wrap up though, there were some other recent Colombian news items I wanted to touch on. For starters, over the last couple of months at the time of recording, there have been some significant developments in the realm of US-Colombia relations, or perhaps more aptly, presidential relations. Namely, President Petro's reputation in the White House has recently experienced a sharp decline. In April 2025, for instance, Petro publicly announced that he believed that his US visa had been revoked, possibly due to diplomatic tensions. Though not explicitly stated, this likely refers, at least in part, to his political stance during the aforementioned deportations that occurred at the beginning of the year. Whatever the case, the US State Department, acting under privacy laws, would neither confirm nor deny this repeal. Months later, however, Petro would find himself in another controversy that would induce a public response from the department. In September of 2025, they would officially announce plans of a visa revocation due to his, quote, reckless and incendiary actions. Specifically, this was referring to an occurrence during a New York protest whereby Petro encouraged US soldiers involved in the Gaza conflict to disobey US orders and instead choose to, quote, obey the orders of humanity. Whilst this statement specifically was the basis for the State Department's decision to revoke his visa, Petro has notably voiced staunch criticism of the Trump administration on numerous other occasions also. The following month, for instance, Petro would accuse the administration of violating international law through the bombing and potential murder of Colombian citizens during a series of boat strikes beginning in September. The strikes were officially described by the US to be targeting narco-traffickers travelling through a known trafficking route off the coast of Venezuela. It was soon reported, however, that a Colombian fisherman named Alejandro Carranza was killed in one of the attacks, despite having no ties to the drug trade. Unfortunately, though verified by several large media outlets, Colombia is unable to formally establish a chain of responsibility due to a lack of legal confirmation from the US on the matter at the time of recording. Still, in response to the claim attacks on Colombian boats more broadly, Petro would act by ordering the suspension of intelligence sharing from all levels of public security forces in Colombia. He stated that the measure would be maintained for as long as the missile strikes on boats in the Caribbean persisted, although this was quickly rolled back by officials in his government. Speaking of fallouts, Petro himself has recently endured another significant blow in US relations. Namely, both he and his family, along with a key minister, Armando Benedetti, have been sanctioned by the US Department of Treasury. Essentially, this means that the designees are blocked from engaging in transactions with anyone in the US and are not allowed to access or transfer any assets they may personally have in the US, such as bank accounts, real estate, and investments. These assets are also blocked from anyone in the US without authorization, effectively freezing them. Unlike Petro's visa revocation, the decision to enforce this measure was not attributed to any particular incident, but rather more broadly Petro's alleged inability to satisfactorily curb drug trafficking from Colombia. Specifically, the Treasury states that Petro has allowed drug cartels to flourish and refused to stop this activity. Petro, in response, however, strongly rebuked this claim, stating in Spanish that "my government has seized more cocaine than any in the entire history of the world," and that what the US Treasury is doing is an arbitrariness typical of an oppressive regime. Whatever the case, it should be noted that US sanctions on sitting political leaders are generally a rare measure only employed in exceptional cases. This is even more true for major bilateral partners such as Colombia, where diplomatic consequences carry greater weight. The fact that Petro has been sanctioned therefore signals a severe mistrust of his government from Washington. In tandem with this decision, the US has also announced the withdrawal of much of its financial aid to Colombia, including anti-narcotics initiatives, human development programs, and security cooperation by an estimated 20% reduction or more. For all of Petro's clashes with the Trump administration, however, controversy has also recently boiled back on Colombian soil for another significant political leader. In July 2025, ex-President Álvaro Uribe would become the subject of a high-profile criminal trial based around allegations of bribery with paramilitary groups. As mentioned earlier in the video, Uribe was alleged to have ties to these groups even before being elected. Investigations into these ties would persist throughout his tenure and would also extend into his post-presidential years when he was serving as senator. It was at this point that a lawyer of Uribe would allegedly bribe former paramilitary members to retract or change testimonies they'd given that linked Uribe to their group during the parapolitics scandal. The allegation of this act and its implications of paramilitary ties would serve the basis of the July 2025 trial, whereby Uribe would ultimately be sentenced to 12 years of house arrest, fined over $500,000 and banned from holding public office for several years. For many Colombian citizens, this would all prove to be highly controversial. Though a polarizing figure, Uribe is famously remembered by many as an invaluable asset for strengthening security in Colombia and defeating guerrillas. Furthermore, many would argue that his trial was driven by politics rather than impartial justice, describing it as political persecution. Whatever the case, Uribe's conviction would later be overturned in October 2025 when Superior Court of Bogotá claimed structural deficiencies in the trial. Specifically, the premise of the original judgment was described as being too vague, while key evidence was said to have been obtained improperly. For many of Uribe's supporters, this overturning has been hailed as a rightful vindication and a correction of judicial bias. Despite the acquittal, however, Uribe may be open to further legal maneuvers should additional appeals emerge. Okay, so that pretty much sums up most of the recent major political news in Colombia. And as a matter of fact, that also, finally, just about brings us to the end of this video. Over the last 3+ hours, we've covered a lot of history, from ancient Colombia to the gold expeditions to Spanish conquest, the wars of independence, the impact of the church, the rise of industry, the political divides, the major civil wars, the 60s cultural revival, the rise of insurgencies, the drug trade, US relations, counterinsurgency, the road to peace, and a whole lot more. I'm sure that you'll agree that the story of Colombia is nothing if not complex, but I also believe that this checkered history is a testament to the nation's resilience, tenacity, and perseverance. With all that in mind, I really hope this video helped deepen your understanding of Colombia and its culture. Personally, as I said at the very beginning of this video, I do truly believe in the value of historical context. I think once you learn how a country's been shaped by centuries of history, you're in a much better position to meaningfully comprehend what you see and experience today. Speaking of today, I've talked a lot about Colombia's past, but some of you may be wondering what the country is like now in present-day 2026. Of course, I already touched on some recent historical developments, but there's obviously a lot more to talk about in terms of culture and life in Colombia more broadly. I won't say much here, but I do want to make it clear that as of the time of recording, I do absolutely recommend visiting the country. As someone who's lived there for a year or so, I can tell you wholeheartedly that there are so many things that make it well worth checking out. Whether it's the endless variety of beautiful landscapes, warm and hospitable people, vibrant cultural festivities, or the pristine weather in many of its popular regions, there's a lot to love here. Also worth noting that the safety situation for tourists has vastly improved over the last couple of decades or so, as long as you follow some basic precautions. Beyond that though, I'm not going to say much more about the country today, as this is actually what the rest of my channel is dedicated towards. If you are interested, I cover all sorts of topics regarding life in modern day Colombia. This ranges from cultural insights, logistical information, and even some stories of my own experiences living in the country. Once again, as a place to start, I'd recommend checking out that playlist I've linked in the description, where I discuss some of my personal favourite aspects of the country. Even if you choose not to watch anything more though, I still want to give a massive thank you for watching to the end of this video. At the time of upload, I'm not currently monetized, so I'm not just saying that because I get ad revenue or anything. I do just really appreciate your support in checking this out and sticking around to the end. You know, it took me around 2 years to make this, and so to know that it was helpful to someone, that makes it all worth it to me. On that note though, I'm going to close this one here. Again, massive thank you to Richard D. Mahoney and his book, which provided a lot of the info in this video. I'll have a link to it in the description if you want to check it out, along with the other resources. Otherwise, feel free to like, subscribe, bell, and I'll see you around. Ciao.